and only gave way slowly before the fury of our attacks. For his part, Napoleon was astonished at how few Russians surrendered. Most of the defeated men retreated in good order, while those who could not mostly chose to die where they stood. Napoleon viewed prisoners as having far higher propaganda value than corpses, and he continued to scour the battlefield for several hours, hoping that a unit somewhere had taken a large number of captives. However, only about 1,000 men had been taken prisoner. In fact, an estimated 8,000 others eluded the French and managed to rejoin their army over the next few days. Among the two armies, somewhere between 250,000 and 322,000 men were involved. Huge amounts of artillery were also involved, with the Russians fielding over 600 guns and the French deploying 587 cannons. The 19,000 men of the French Imperial Guard, Napoleon's finest soldiers, were present on the battlefield and were never committed to the fighting, making the actual number of French sent into action somewhere around 110,000 men. All told, between 70,000 and 80,000 men were killed or wounded, including 47 French and 23 Russian generals. And while the Russian army was defeated but not broken, the way to Moscow was now open to the French. Some of the men wounded on the battlefield, both French and Russian, were retrieved for treatment, but the majority were left where they fell, soon to die of their injuries or exposure. There was no food to give the wounded in any case, and even those who were treated soon died, their systems unable to stand the strain of wounds with such little caloric intake. September 7th would be the deadliest single day of combat in history until World War I, and the sheer volume of artillery and musket fire ensured that the whole landscape became a lethal storm of lead and iron in which flesh had been punctured, mangled, and blown into shredded chunks with fatal efficiency. Jean-Ambroise Baston de Lariboisière, the Inspector General of the French artillery, would later calculate that the French alone fired 60,000 cannonballs and 1.4 million musket shots during the 10-hour battle, an average of over 100 artillery rounds and 2,300 musket shots per minute. If the Russians fired at least as many rounds, the combined average rate of fire would be a staggering 3.5 cannonballs and 78 musket rounds per second for the entire battle. Kutuzov had made his stand in front of Moscow, and it came at a great cost. While the advantages of defensive warfare, including choice of terrain, fortifications, and interior lines, typically resulted in higher casualties for the attackers during the Napoleonic Wars, the losses at Borodino were nearly equal. This was largely owing to Kutuzov's prioritization of the right wing and the comparatively poor performance of the Russian artillery compared to their French counterparts. The Russians also paid dearly in senior leadership, with the Second Army's commander falling mortally wounded and numerous casualties among corps and division commanders, including Raevsky, Tuchkov, and Kutaisov of the reserve artillery. But the fight at the Fleches had bloodied multiple French corps and likely convinced Napoleon to not employ his precious Imperial Guard. As the Baron de Jomini concluded, "The morale of an army and its chief officers has an influence upon the fate of a war." The Russian army was not destroyed and would remain a threat to the French, and Kutuzov was not at all discouraged by the result at Borodino. At the time, the total losses on the French side were estimated at around 20,000 wounded and 10,000 dead, leaving only about 100,000 men available to Napoleon after Borodino. Most of the French casualties had occurred in the center of the battle where the French units were concentrated, with the Poles and Italians on the flanks only playing a limited role. Leadership losses were also extensive. The French counted 47 generals and 36 colonels commanding regiments among the wounded or killed. The French had missed multiple opportunities to cut up the scattered Russian army at and before Smolensk, but with the scale of this invasion being far larger than his previous campaigns, Napoleon's fingertip leadership style did not suit the theater of operations, with too many corps spread across too much distance. Napoleon also failed to provide a suitable base of operations, with Poland unable to sustain a force of over 500,000 stretching deep into Russia. Most importantly, the French emperor grossly underestimated the resolve of his opponent to withstand casualties and hardships, up to abandoning their own capital. After multiple defeats, the Russians continued to oppose the French occupation, while disease, hunger, and battle continued to reduce their opponents' numbers. The Russians were able to replace battle losses while moving additional armies to cut off the French supply lines. Clausewitz's On War explored the differences from Napoleon's previous successes to his culminating battle in Russia. If a victory has primarily shaken the opponent's confidence, then the lost engagement turns into defeat on a scale not produced by every victory. Jena and Belle Alliance were defeats on this scale. Borodino was not. French strength, reduced from the onset with smaller campaigns on the flanks of the main army, had reached critical levels by Borodino. Only about 135,000 men were fit to fight on the day of the battle, which Clausewitz believed factored into Napoleon's decision to content himself with only a partial victory, not because he thought the issue was still in doubt, but because a total victory would have cost him more than he was able to pay. The French in Moscow. Major Louis-Joseph Vionnet toured the field at dawn on September 8th and found a surreal and appalling spectacle. I noticed that in many places the corpses were piled up on top of one another. The blood had formed into little streams, and the round shot and canister so covered the ground that they resembled hail in the aftermath of a terrible storm. I could not see how a single person could have escaped. Yet I was even more amazed when I visited some of the ravines. So many shells had rolled there it was simply beyond comprehension. I swear that I myself first thought that the shells must have been stored there. Besides being literally heaped with cannonballs, canister shot, and unexploded shells, the ravines were filled with countless dead and wounded men who had crawled there to get out of the cold wind sweeping over the battlefield. Weeks later, the corpses of most of these luckless individuals would still be there laying in the open as the French army retreated across the battlefield after abandoning Moscow, no doubt offering a macabre presage for the surviving Grande Armee's soldiers as they began the long trek home. With Kutuzov in retreat, Napoleon was able to resume his advance on Moscow, leaving 6 square miles of landscape around Borodino carpeted with the slain. The emperor was confident, or at least feigned confidence, that the Russians would surrender once their capital was seized, but when the French arrived in Moscow a week after the battle, they found a bizarre and dismal scene. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and while thousands still remained, released convicts were skulking about the streets, plundering and committing arson. Even worse, the city was on fire. Moscow burned for 6 days, and 3/4 of its buildings would be destroyed. Kutuzov, with the Tsar's blessing, had allowed the French to take the nearly empty capital, which would be fully incapable of supporting them through the winter. Meanwhile, the Russians maintained positions that provided the opportunity to strike devastating blows on overextended supply lines. As Clausewitz described in his vision for such a scenario, once both parties have reached the end of the aggressor's offensive, the defender should take up a position at an angle to the direction of that line and exert pressure on the enemy's rear by all means at his disposal. Kutuzov's tactical disposition was congruent with that strategic goal. Though it was long assumed by historians that the Tsar was responsible for the fires, recent examination of Russian historical documents reveals that Alexander never ordered the city set ablaze, and was actually appalled and infuriated when he learned it was burning. While the French were blamed for the fires by the Russians, Napoleon was equally baffled by the fires and obviously had no wish for Moscow to burn, since it was supposed to provide food and shelter for his troops, and if intact, a sort of hostage to be used in negotiations with the Tsar. Thus, it's still a mystery as to who actually burned the Russian capital. There are 2 likely possibilities. The most likely is that marauding Cossacks, probably under Kutuzov's orders, set fire to the city, and the general later remained mum about his role in the arson to avoid the wrath of the Tsar and the ordinary inhabitants of Moscow, an estimated 12,000 of whom burned to death. The other is that the fires were accidental, a result of cooking fires left unattended or possibly lightning strikes in a city made out of highly flammable seasoned timbers. Whatever the case, the 2,000 men of the Moscow Fire Department had fled to a man as the French approached, and with the right combination of neglect and wind, Unintentional fires could have potentially combined into a firestorm, reducing the city to mounds of smoking ash. The Great Fire of Chicago, the Peshtigo Fire, and the fires after the San Francisco earthquake are all examples of conflagrations, started accidentally and rapidly growing to uncontrollable, roaring sheets of flames that leveled huge tracts of cities with no actual arson required to account for their destructive power. Word also arrived that 2 Russian forces were closing on the French supply lines from the north and south. Rapp reported on the fear that afflicted even the general officers in their brief stay in Moscow, and that Napoleon was not aware of how precarious the situation was, even as he kept attempting to negotiate with the Russians to surrender. In recalling his conversations with General Narbonne, who the Emperor sent to check on Rapp daily, he wrote, "This general, like many others of our army, was very uneasy. He often said to me that the Emperor was wrong in calculating on peace, that we were not in a condition to dictate conditions, that the Russians had not sacrificed their capital to accept of disadvantageous terms. They are amusing us, in order to take their revenge and to have fairer sport." Despite their dire position, the French remained in Moscow for 5 weeks, while Napoleon kept awaiting peace envoys from the Tsar and divisions of Cossacks prowled nearby. Tsar Alexander wisely made Napoleon wait in Moscow for the disastrous cold to arrive by sending envoys with tantalizing offers, which never really amounted to anything. As Major Louis-Joseph Vianney noted, an emissary arrived carrying what appeared to be terms for the conclusion of a peace. This seemed to me, as well as to a number of other officers, a kind of trap designed to keep us in Moscow until the harsh season was upon us. The Emperor fell into this trap with his eyes wide open. Although it wasn't everything they hoped for, the seizure of Moscow did enable the French to eat much better than they had for months, and the rate of deaths from starvation and illness temporarily dropped off. Large quantities of potatoes were harvested from the nearby fields at the order of Napoleon, and those not eaten immediately were stored for the use of the Grande Armee in the future. However, as the weather grew steadily worse, Napoleon eventually recognized the realities of the situation and ordered the Grande Armee to retreat. The evacuation commenced on October 19th, ahead of the first snows, but amid bitter cold. The French were now demoralized and were not carrying sufficient food for the long march back to the Niemen River and the relative safety of Poland. Napoleon had led his army into a death trap and failed utterly to achieve his objectives. In fact, he had likely doomed his empire, history's most notorious retreat. As the French set out from Moscow on their dreary retreat, an extremely dense fog set in for days, chilling and soaking the men and causing vast confusion and delays on the road. Worse was to follow as a massive ice storm swept through on November 5th, glazing the suddenly frozen ground with a slick layer on which men and animals constantly fell. The French had brought frost shoes for their horses with spikes for traction, but most of these soon broke and could not be replaced. An attempt was made to wrap the horses' hooves in cloth for improved grip on the slippery ground, but the cloth soon became ineffective as well. November 6th brought the first snows, and the death rate among the French began to skyrocket. Few were yet freezing directly, but the intense cold and moisture raised their caloric needs greatly, and men began to fall and die in droves from starvation once again. The cold intensified as the French proceeded, and even though the winter was actually mild for the region they were passing through, the burned-out, denuded landscape offered no food, shelter, or even firewood. The entire expedition would likely have perished long before reaching the border if not for the supply of meat furnished by their own horses, hundreds of which died each day on the roadside. Harried by constant Cossack attacks, the French finally began to succumb to cold as well as hunger, with both working in concert to kill men in enormous numbers. Auguste de Caulaincourt, one of Napoleon's aides and generals, personally witnessed thousands of men die from the cold, with the same scenario repeating itself over and over again in countless individual dramas. The cold was so intense that bivouacking was no longer supportable. Bad luck to those who fell asleep by a campfire. Furthermore, disorganization was perceptibly gaining ground in the Guard. One constantly found men who, overcome by the cold, had been forced to drop out and had fallen to the ground, too weak or too numb to stand. Ought one to help them along, which practically meant carrying them? They begged one to let them alone. There were bivouacs all along the road. Ought one to take them to a campfire? Once these poor wretches fell asleep, they were dead. If they resisted the craving for sleep, another passer-by would help them along a little farther, thus prolonging their agony for a short while, but not saving them, for in this condition the drowsiness engendered by cold is irresistibly strong. Sleep comes inevitably, and to sleep is to die. I tried in vain to save a number of these unfortunates. The only words they uttered were to beg me for the love of God to go away and let them sleep. To hear them, one would have thought sleep was their salvation. Unhappily, it was a poor wretch's last wish, but at least he ceased to suffer, without pain or agony. Gratitude and even a smile was imprinted on his discolored lips. What I have related about the effects of extreme cold, and of this kind of death by freezing, is based on what I saw happen to thousands of individuals. The road was covered with their corpses. Freezing to death was indeed merciful compared to that by starvation alone, or even a musket shot. Many of Napoleon's luckless soldiers drifted off into death, imagining themselves warm and comfortable, rather than sprawled on frozen mud with snow piling up on their bodies and faces. But not all of the roughly 480,000 men who failed to return from the campaign died, because according to Russian records, they took approximately 100,000 prisoners during the retreat, many of whom likely had a better chance of survival than the men marching on under Napoleon's tattered eagles. That said, some Cossack and partisan leaders were known for executing prisoners, albeit opting to do so furtively, due to the Russian officer corps' intense abhorrence for such actions at the time. The Russian officers didn't reject it out of mercy. Many prisoners were never returned to their home countries, but instead kept in Russia in accordance with long-standing Russian tradition that had them eventually integrated into the Russian population. Within a few years, several entire foreign regiments in the Russian army were made up of former Napoleonic soldiers who were absorbed into the Tsar's empire and were put to work defending the country they had recently invaded. The final grueling action occurred at the Berezina River on November 28th. A single bridge provided a crossing point for the 120,000 or so men who still remained out of Napoleon's once enormous Grande Armee. In a panic, the horde floundered across, pushing many people off the edges of the bridge into the icy waters to die. The Polish division heroically screened the retreat as long as possible from the Russian army, which closed in an effort to capture the remnants. But the Poles were eventually driven back and set fire to the bridge as they did so. 20,000 soldiers were left on the east bank of the Berezina. Some leaped into the water, where cramps and bitter cold quickly caused them to sink and drown. The rest were taken prisoner by the pursuing Russians. Two legends have attached themselves to the Berezina crossing. The first is that the French burned all their banners and eagles in a ceremony overseen by Napoleon to prevent them from falling into Russian hands. In reality, a few eagles and banners were burned, but many officers wrapped their flags around their bodies, ensuring they would not be taken while they remained alive and free. The other is that the last man to cross the bridge was Marshal Michel Ney. Over 200 years later, it is impossible to say if this is true, but it is certain that the red-haired bravest of the brave remained with the Polish division to cover the retreat, and was among the last of those to cross the Berezina bridge, though whether he was literally last will never be known for sure. By the time Napoleon was out of Russia, only 25,000 soldiers of the original invasion force returned with him. Overall, the French and Allied troops lost about 570,000 men in the campaign, more than the initial invasion force thanks to the supply of reinforcements during the campaign. The Russians, who never won a single battle during the invasion, had lost about 150,000 soldiers. Of course, for Napoleon, the nightmare was far from over after the retreat ended. The customary winter lull in campaigning, not to mention the casualties the Russians had sustained at Borodino, bought him time to raise another conscript army, boosting the Grande Armee's numbers to 350,000. However, these new troops were a mere shadow of the ones he had lost in Russia, and Napoleon was acutely aware that these raw, untried recruits could be unreliable in battle. Napoleon also rightly anticipated that a battle was coming. Following the Grande Armee's annihilation, Napoleon's enemies all across Europe had taken heart and risen up in arms again. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and even Sweden, governed by Napoleon's erstwhile Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, were preparing for battle. All the European powers were fielding their armies, determined to rid themselves of Napoleon once and for all. Against all odds, Napoleon would not let himself be easily subdued. Despite news of fresh reversals in Spain that had seen the French forced out of their strongholds and back to the Franco-Spanish border in the Pyrenees by Wellington's British forces and their Spanish and Portuguese allies, Napoleon rallied his new Grande Armee and proceeded to ravage the advancing Prussian, Austrian, and Russian forces on the German front at the Battle of Dresden in 1813. Once again, Napoleon managed to slice the enemy army in two, this time using a turning movement along one of the flanks and using a cavalry charge to follow it up. Napoleon inflicted 4 times more casualties than his army suffered, but ailment forced him from the field, and he was unable to follow up this success. The French had been outnumbered nearly 2-1 at Dresden, and even after their victory, they remained heavily outnumbered. The Sixth Coalition was capable of putting 1 million men into fields across Europe, and Napoleon couldn't possibly defend the entire French Empire against that number. Duke Wellington once famously said Napoleon alone was worth 50,000 men in the field, but even genius had to cave to the laws of mathematics, and there was little Napoleon could do about the fact that he was consistently outnumbered by 2 or 3 to 1. Napoleon had defied long odds while commanding seasoned veterans, but most of those veterans had been lost on the plains of Russia. Fate eventually caught up to Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, also fittingly known as the Battle of Nations. After Dresden, the coalition's commanding generals actually implemented a strategy that sought to give battle against the French only in fields where Napoleon was not present, thereby fighting only against his marshals. Austrian, Prussian, Russian, and Swedish forces began advancing on a wide front against Napoleon. After weeks of marching and counter-marching, Napoleon was confronted at Leipzig by an army twice his army's size. The battle was bloody, with over 600,000 combatants involved and almost 100,000 casualties. But Napoleon escaped complete encirclement and was able to retreat with only 70,000 men in good fighting order, leaving approximately 40,000 scattered stragglers to fend for themselves. Napoleon had finally suffered a decisive defeat in a pitched battle, and his retreat ceded French control of Prussia permanently. France was now an island in a storm. British, Spanish, and Portuguese armies pressed through the Pyrenees in the south and attacked Bordeaux, while Russians, Austrians, and Prussians closed in from the north and west. Napoleon lashed out, winning a series of minor victories inside France proper, but he was powerless in the face of ever-growing enemy forces. The barrel of French conscription had been scraped dry, and there were no more troops to be had. In March 1814, the Allied forces took Paris. Napoleon hoped to use the remnants of his army to attack the coalition forces in Paris itself, but his generals threatened mutiny. A few days later, under considerable pressure from his marshals, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. At first, he attempted to secure the succession for his young son born by the Austrian Princess Marie-Louise, but this was refused by the coalition, whose rulers were still European royalty and fully intended to ensure the restoration of the ousted Bourbon in France. Napoleon was forced to abdicate unconditionally. For the first time, Napoleon found himself on the losing end of a treaty. The terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau denied him and his heirs any claim to the throne of France, assigned his wife and son to the Austrian court, and banished Napoleon himself, with a small honor guard, to the small island of Elba, a lick of land home to some 10,000 inhabitants off the Italian coast. Napoleon, seemingly resigned to his fate, bid an extremely moving farewell to his veterans of the Old Guard, which left many of the hardened soldiers in tears. Having bid his most loyal soldiers goodbye, Napoleon took ship for his exile in Elba. He would escape in 1815 and lead the French during the 100 Days that year, but that would only lead him to Waterloo on June 18th. In hindsight, it's apparent that the Russian invasion was a turning point for Napoleon, and for that reason, it remains heavily debated, romanticized, and scorned, depending on the perspective. It also means the campaign has had its fair share of embellishment. For example, myths, and a dash of misguided common-sense guesswork, have often asserted that the bitter cold of the Russian winter destroyed the French army, but the intense winter cold merely represented the final executioner. If anything, many of the Grande Armee's members were already doomed to die by Napoleon's miscalculations before the first drum beat the muster in May 1812, and Napoleon's vast force was already in trouble when it set out across the Polish plain, fated to suffer death through exhaustion, disease, and starvation. The cold only brought death to those who lived longer than those who succumbed to famine or battle or the lances and sabers of the Cossacks. Tens of thousands of men simply went to sleep in the snow, drifting away in a comfortable, illusory warmth that spared them the agonies of exhausted marching, hunger pangs, and the fatal impact of steel or lead. In truth, the Grande Armee was destroyed by the inexorable mathematics of time, distance, and caloric intake. Napoleon is famously credited for the maxim that an army marches on its stomach, but he seemingly ignored his own advice in 1812, impatiently pushing forward even as the wagons of food moved far slower than men, particularly over Russia's poorly developed roads and tracks. Every step the Grande Armee advanced burned calories, and also took it further from the glacially slow supply wagons bringing up the rear. Napoleon gathered a force too immense for his era's logistics to realistically sustain, and his men paid for it with their lives. To their credit, the Russians exacerbated the problem faced by the French through their scorched earth tactics, but even had they left the countryside intact, the Grande Armee would likely have withered. A foraging party can venture only a few miles from the line of march and still hope to return to the bivouac with food the same day. Nor can such a party bring back infinite quantities of food. Herds of domestic animals partly solve the problem, but fodder for horses is bulky, and the loss of those animals steadily degraded the radius within which practical foraging was possible. Even split into columns advancing along parallel routes, over 500,000 men and 100,000 horses represented a swarm which the early 19th century's technology could not logistically support in such concentration. Food could not be moved into the area rapidly enough to exceed the rate of consumption. Furthermore, distribution of the food that arrived was bungled, and though this was not primarily Napoleon's main initial concern, it should have been once it became obvious famine was destroying his forces. Ironically, Napoleon could perhaps have won his war with Russia had he used a smaller force of elite, hand-picked soldiers whose resupply was far easier and abetted by a slower advance with more limited initial objectives. This would have permitted the progressive stocking of vast supply depots to support his army in a hostile countryside. Instead, he chose a route that resulted in the loss of the vast majority of his army, and even had the French army been outfitted with the era's finest winter clothing, hunger would have claimed nearly as many. With his 1812 expedition, Napoleon succeeded only in killing almost all of the men most loyal to him, not to mention the majority of his seasoned veterans. Rather than enthusiasm, the mood of the army towards their leader was transformed into bitterness, and untrained recruits, often too young for effective military service, were drafted to replace the tough, experienced volunteers who were wasted by the hundreds of thousands on the sun-baked, rain-drenched roads to Moscow. A well-oiled and reliable fighting machine was replaced by a huge but cobbled-together, poorly trained horde with low morale, making Leipzig and Waterloo, or defeats like them, near certainties. The Sixth Coalition. For Napoleon, the nightmare was far from over even after the retreat from Russia ended. The customary winter lull in campaigning, not to mention the casualties the Russians had sustained at Borodino, bought him time to raise another conscript army, boosting the Grand Army's numbers to 350,000. However, These new troops were a mere shadow of the ones he had lost in Russia, and Napoleon was acutely aware these raw, untried recruits could be unreliable in battle. Napoleon also rightly anticipated that a battle was coming. Following the French army's annihilation, Napoleon's enemies all across Europe had taken heart and risen up in arms again. Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Spain, Portugal, and even Sweden, governed by Napoleon's erstwhile Marshal Bernadotte, were preparing for battle. All the European powers were fielding their armies, determined to rid themselves of Napoleon once and for all. Larger nations sought the destruction of the French Empire as an existential threat, while smaller countries maneuvered to survive, appeasing or opposing Napoleon as seemed most expedient at any given moment. The Russian army moved into Poland and eventually engaged the French in Germany as the fighting of spring 1813 began in earnest. Napoleon's disastrous retreat not only demoralized his own men and decimated his veteran regiments, but also revived the hopes of his more formidable adversaries, such as the Prussians and Austrians, that he could be overthrown. The mentally damaged but influential Prussian general Gebhard Leberecht von Blucher provided impetus to the alliance through his keen determination to see Napoleon crushed, avenging the French victory over his beloved Prussia that initially unhinged him. Ironically, Napoleon's own success in changing the culture of Europe sowed the proverbial dragon's teeth that rose into hostile armies against him. Feudalism reigned supreme on the continent for many centuries, in which loyalty belonged to an individual lord or monarch, or at least the house from which these rulers sprang, while nationalism took a distant second seat in human perspective. The idea of nation-states had gathered steady impetus and strength as the Renaissance and Enlightenment periods progressed. Nevertheless, personal fealty frequently continued to outweigh national pride in providing motivation to fighting men, whether ordinary soldiers or the generally aristocratic officers who led them, frequently creating situations in which loyalty was owed to a foreign potentate who controlled a specific territory through marriage or conquest. Patriotism, devotion to one's nation, culture, and language rather than a particular ruler or aristocratic lineage, was latent and gathering strength, however. The Dutch Revolt and the ultimately more successful American Revolution provided the first modern examples of nation-states in which the ruler only possessed legitimacy and commanded loyalty insofar as they served as native representatives of the country as a whole. The French Revolution brought the fire of patriotism to a major European power, providing the revolutionary armies with a high level of motivation that stood them in good stead in their struggles with the monarchies seeking to end the republican phenomenon before it spread to their territories and deprived them of their age-old power and privilege. Napoleon's victories inadvertently exported the spirit of nationalism, though not necessarily that of democracy, across the whole European continent. The slow tectonic shift of European thought away from personal fealty and towards patriotism abruptly became an avalanche under the spur of Napoleon's conquests. Dying feudalism offered only a lukewarm motivator to armies of the early 19th century, and men fought more out of habitual obedience than with any strong desire to serve. Patriotism, on the other hand, made every individual a stakeholder in the outcome, creating a fierce drive to succeed and win a collective victory for the nation-state. Napoleon awakened German patriotism and an unwillingness to serve a French emperor or see control of German territories remain as the appendage of a foreign ruler. His armies carried patriotism abroad, kindled an answering patriotism, and built an empire on a revolutionary foundation that rejected the concept of a territory or nation tamely submitting to the rule of a foreign emperor. The campaign of 1813 was to become known by its patriotic title, the War of German Liberation. The moral forces which had once given impetus to the armies of revolutionary France were now coming back to haunt them. The war was to be for the liberation of Germany, more than half a century before an actual nation-state by that name emerged. Not every circumstance favored Napoleon's opponents, however. With the hindsight of Waterloo, it is all too easy to fall into a depiction of the emperor's later years as a sort of highly didactic morality play, in which the Corsican's fortunes followed a smoothly descending, predestined arc from hubris through defeat to final destruction and exile. However, the French still had an immensely valuable military asset: Napoleon himself. In 1813 and 1814, the emperor proved himself a dangerous adversary, tactically and strategically superior to many of the commanders arrayed against him. Though he was sloppy and crippled by arrogance in Russia, the shock of losing the preponderance of his army apparently brought him back to his senses and refocused his faculties, reviving much of the martial genius responsible for his empire's initial expansion. His enemies won, but barely, and the later portions of the Battle of Leipzig showed this clearly, when Napoleon very nearly fought about 430,000 men to a standstill with just over 150,000 soldiers of his own, many of them raw recruits. Though a number of countries allied themselves against the French, their pact remained shaky throughout the first half of 1813. Several of the allies, notably Sweden and Austria, were reluctant to commit too fully to the anti-Napoleonic faction, while the issue of the war was still in doubt. Support for the Sixth Coalition waxed when the League won successes against the French in the field, but it waned when the resurgent French won even a minor victory. Even more than usual in war, the spring campaign of 1813 mixed politics and martial endeavor, as Napoleon and his foes alternately negotiated and fought, attempting to detach supporters from one another's camps. Prussia, Russia, and England formed a determined triumvirate, which ultimately ensured the Sixth Coalition's survival. Both Britain and Russia were out of easy reach of Napoleon and thus felt less intimidated by his armies. Powerful fleets shielded the English from invasion and permitted them to interfere with Napoleon's economy via the Continental blockade. Russia's geographic remoteness and huge size had defeated the French once already, and Tsar Alexander did not fear a second invasion, knowing clearly how much the first had devastated Napoleon's war-making capabilities. Austria represented a pivotal faction due to its immense authority in Germany and its large, brave, and somewhat unwieldy army. Though opposed to Napoleon, its support for the coalition remained tepid for the first half of 1813. Victory was far less assured for the coalition if Austria decided upon neutrality, or even worse, opted to support Napoleon. Consequently, the Austrian Emperor Franz I's wishes carried considerable weight with his allies, and it proved necessary to proceed with tact in dealing with him. The situation was fraught with shifting loyalties, uncertainty, and opportunism. Perfidious Albion was behind the scenes everywhere, offering encouragement and golden guineas to whomever would risk his throne to overthrow the archenemy. The rulers of Germany's smaller states were caught between popular discontent and a desire for self-preservation and loyalty to the man who had, after all, made them a present of regal status. The lesser princes of Germany vacillated. Prussia and Russia were the initial founders of the Sixth Coalition in late February 1813, joined on March 3 by England and Sweden. Sweden's leader, Charles XIV John, was, bizarrely enough, a former French marshal who had served in Napoleon's armies until 1810, when the Swedes elected him to their throne. Destined to remain King of Sweden and Norway until his death in 1844 at the age of 81 years, Charles XIV John was initially a somewhat reluctant ally against his former emperor, but remained committed to the coalition nevertheless. During April 1813, the coalition forces advanced westward across Germany, snapping up Dresden in Saxony as the high watermark of their initial success. The French went on the offensive at the start of May, however, and Napoleon used his time-tested strategy of advancing his forces in multiple columns. These columns were compact and could move much more rapidly than most of his adversaries, but could combine quickly into a larger force once contact with the enemy was established and a battle began. The first major action occurred at the Battle of Lutzen on May 2, 1813, close to the place where King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had perished in 1632 during the 30 Years' War. Here, a flanking attack by a Prusso-Russian force under the Russian general Peter Graf zu Wittgenstein surprised Napoleon's column of 144,000 men marching on Leipzig. The Allies, nearly 95,000 strong, were hoping to defeat Napoleon's army piecemeal, After denying Napoleon the possession of Leipzig, they hoped to drive him back on the Bohemian border, forcing him to surrender. They were unsuccessful and withdrew from the battlefield that evening. The battle was hard fought on both sides, and the men of both the coalition and the French Empire amply proved their stubborn courage in the brutal clash. During initial scouting, French Marshal Jean-Baptiste Bessières, an extremely loyal supporter and friend of Napoleon, died instantly when a ricocheting cannonball smashed his chest apart. 22,000 French and 11,500 Allied soldiers were casualties of the battle, which was eventually decided when Napoleon arrived to deploy 80 cannon and further French columns began to reach the battlefield. By May 8th, the French ousted the coalition forces from Dresden in Saxony. The Russian general Peter Wittgenstein was defeated narrowly at Bautzen on May 22nd, and 6 days later the experienced, highly skilled Marshal Davout took Hamburg, previously vacated by the French on March 12th. The advancing French reached the Oder River on June 1, 1813, and at this point, a hiatus occurred in the conflict as each side sought Austria's support. The armistice between Napoleon and the Allies was agreed on the 4th of June. Subsequently, at Austria's insistence, the Allies very unwillingly agreed to extend it until the 10th of August. During the armistice, a peace conference opened in Prague, with Austria mediating between the two sides. Austria had secretly committed itself to joining the Allied cause unless Napoleon agreed to the 4 minimal Austrian conditions for peace by the 10th of August. The Austrians essentially demanded that Napoleon withdraw behind the Rhine, making that river his eastern frontier. Predictably, with considerably larger territories currently in his possession, and his armies still undefeated in the field, the French emperor refused these terms, although they would have left him in power and with a considerable empire still under his sway. Though the armistice now extended to August 16th, the Austrians declared war on August 12, 1813, and the Prussians broke the ceasefire by impatiently recommencing the war on the following day. With Austrian forces finally committed to the war on side of the coalition, the conflict opened a new phase. Political maneuvering suddenly took a back seat to action in the field, though considerations of statecraft still exerted a greater than normal influence on the course of individual events. The stage was now set for the climactic clash at Leipzig, though smaller battles and maneuvers occupied the remaining months between the resumption of hostilities on August 13, 1813, and the first shots of the decisive battle on October 14. During the latter days of the armistice on August 3, 1813, one of the most colorfully eccentric characters of the Napoleonic Wars, Joachim Murat, re-entered the scene. The archetypal dashing cavalryman, he stood out even among his contemporaries for his courage, fiery nature, and extravagant attire. Appearing in brilliant uniforms festooned with glistening plumes, gold brocade, and other rich ornamentation, and sporting a head of thickly curling black hair, the debonair marshal was a notorious ladies' man who generally wore extremely tight pants so that women could admire his physique. He was also married to Napoleon's sister Caroline, and he served as a Marshal of France for many years. He was ultimately fated to die in front of a Neapolitan firing squad with the fearless command to the soldiers executing him of "Soldiers, do your duty, right to the heart but spare the face. Fire!" In 1813, however, Murat was king of Naples thanks to Napoleon. After the failed invasion of Russia, he had retired to his kingdom, maintaining a stance of quasi-neutrality during the opening phases of the War of the Sixth Coalition. In mid-1813, the dandy king still felt some loyalty to Napoleon, but also wished to preserve his kingdom. 13 days before the armistice was to expire, he made his appearance. Late on the afternoon of August 3rd, Murat reached Rome. He had an interview with the French military governor, General Merciless. He told him that if there was peace, he would be back in a fortnight. If there was war, he would stay with the emperor. Traveling by way of Roveredo and through the Tyrol by Innsbruck and Botzen, he reached Dresden on the 14th. He had passed through Austrian territory on the eve of the declaration of war. Thus, Napoleon regained the services of one of his most aggressive and popular cavalry marshals on the cusp of his struggle to retain Germany. Whether or not Napoleon felt any personal affront at Marat's earlier semi-neutral stance is unclear, but the wily Corsican knew that it was smart to welcome his brother-in-law and fellow monarch with open arms. He did so, therefore, and appointed Marat the overall commander of cavalry for the coming campaign. If Napoleon could regain the initiative and start accumulating victories, Austria might still possibly back out of the war, and without the Austrians, the Sixth Coalition would lack the manpower and the material resources to prosecute the war to Napoleon's defeat. The French might even beat them in the field, reconquer Prussia, and likely disarm it entirely rather than making it part of the imperial military system, and force Russia to either accept a formal peace or effectively cede one by retreating within its own borders. Clashes occurred almost immediately after the armistice's end, highlighting how close the opponents were to one another in this Central European theater of war. On August 23rd, the French Marshal Nicolas Oudinot, advancing to take the Prussian capital of Berlin at the head of 3 columns of men totaling some 80,000 men, received a bloody nose due to lack of successful cavalry scouting. Prussian infantry repulsed 1 column after a prolonged battle in a tract of woodland along the route of march. The Battle of Grossbeeren took place at the village of the same name, where Oudinot's central column ejected an inferior force of Prussians after a short, sharp fight. The mixed force of French and Saxons began to set up a camp in and around the village as a torrential, cold rainstorm began. However, they were unaware of the Prussian General von Bülow's 3rd Prussian Corps, made up of 40,000 infantry and cavalry, moving swiftly towards them behind the gray curtains of rain. It was only when a heavy barrage of Prussian artillery fire crashed into the town that the French realized they were under attack. An artillery duel followed and lasted for nearly 90 minutes, during which the entire village of Grossbeeren was set ablaze despite the continued pounding rain. Once many of the French guns fell silent, the Prussian infantry moved forward in huge masses, the roll and beat of their drums half muffled by the continuing downpour. Few muskets would fire, and a bayonet melee ensued in which the French eventually broke and ran. Von Bülow's men, soaked, chilled, and utterly exhausted, began setting up their own camp around the burning village as night set in. At that moment, the 3rd French column arrived and launched a cavalry attack. The Prussian Life Guard hussars counterattacked, leading to a blind, desperate cavalry melee in the rainy darkness. The men beat the French off again, and the Prussians dragged themselves back to their tents. Only 3,000 men were lost on the French side, and 1,000 on the Prussian side, making this minor battle by Napoleonic standards, but news of this defeat, and the others that were to come in the following days, had a demoralizing effect on the French. The Prussians were uplifted by the fact that unaided they had won their first victory since the dark days of 1806. The loss of Napoleon's experienced cavalry in Russia, and the deaths of countless highly trained cavalry horses capable of sustaining fatigue and remaining calm in the presence of heavy firing and the smells of blood and fear, was beginning to make itself felt. Lack of adequate cavalry and mounted scouting forces surpassed all other difficulties confronting the French following the 1812 Russian campaign, and Napoleon, furious at Oudinot's failure at Grossbeeren, demoted him to a trivial command under Marshal Michel Ney. Oudinot, enraged in turn at this punishment, began working deliberately to sabotage the orders he received. Within a short time, his attempt at revenge produced a catastrophe that improved the Allies' morale, while weakening that of the French. All the while, the actions that followed set a definite pattern. Wherever Napoleon commanded in person, the coalition forces either gave battle and suffered defeat at his hands, or prudently retreated out of reach. On the other hand, when Napoleon's subordinates led an army against the enemy in his absence, the Allied forces drubbed the French badly, though often at considerable cost. Napoleon's personal leadership was the crucial element in the elixir of victory, and even the most dashing of his subordinates, Ney, Marat, Oudinot, and Marshal Jacques MacDonald, were unable to duplicate his successes or stand in successfully for him. This constituted a dangerous weakness during warfare on such a scale. Dozens of armies were in motion on both sides, and Napoleon could not be everywhere at once. yet everything seemingly depended upon him. His marshals and generals were not, for the most part, keen tactical or strategic geniuses, but brave, inspiring corps commanders who gave excellent service when the emperor gave them clear orders to carry out. When operating independently, however, they blundered, missed opportunities, and frequently enough retreated after trivial setbacks, afraid to take risks not already approved by Napoleon. Most of these leaders, in short, lacked personal initiative and strong tactical sense, wasting men and time on poorly conceived maneuvers. Napoleon's battlefield successes rested on both his high military intellect and the moral effect of his presence. Another weakness of Napoleonic command was that Napoleon was not a scientific general. He understood clearly how to win in most situations, yet he did so intuitively, examining the battle as it developed and issuing orders that he instinctively knew to be correct. His sixth sense for finding the precise maneuver needed to achieve victory at any given moment was very keen, but it was not something he could teach to his subordinates. His method was improvisational rather than systematic, and therefore unique to himself. The Napoleonic command system was too inflexible. The emperor could broach no successful rivals, but without them he was unable to win this campaign. The decisive battle he sought was eluding him. With a growing number of victories to their credit, the Allies were growing more confident. With the threat of reinforcements arriving from Russia, Napoleon urgently needed to regain the initiative. The emperor also served as a sort of living banner. Wherever he appeared, the French fought with astonishing, overwhelming tenacity and fanaticism, furiously mauling the enemy despite whatever losses they sustained in the process. The Corsicans' presence had the opposite effect on coalition forces, filling both rank and file and their generals with dread and strongly inclining them to retreat rather than face such a tactician in the field. At the same time, the burden of command began to weigh heavily on the French emperor. He spent the autumn of 1813 in constant motion in the saddle, hurrying from point to another, attempting to be everywhere and do everything, but he could not achieve this goal. He was responsible for more than any one human being could handle, no matter how intelligent and energetic they might be, and the pressure wore on him physically and mentally. Moreover, the emperor was frequently soaked to the skin for days at a time in the torrential cold rains that haunted Germany during this crucial year. Aging, and even perhaps suffering from the first symptoms of a gradual stomach cancer, and under colossal strain from the massive responsibility he could share with nobody else, Napoleon was in the unenviable position of one man in a crisis attempting to do the work of at least a dozen key command personnel. After Oudinot's abortive effort to advance on Berlin, the Crown Prince of Sweden advanced southward with his Prussians and other Allied troops, pushing Oudinot before him. General Jean-Baptiste Gérard advanced from the west to offer Oudinot support, encountering elements of the Crown Prince's army at the Battle of Hagelberg on August 27th. Predictably, Gérard suffered defeat and fell back in turn. The main army of the coalition, nearly 200,000 men under Field Marshal Karl Philipp von Schwarzenberg, was advancing towards Leipzig, but in late August, he suddenly diverted towards Dresden. A mere rumored sighting of Napoleon threw its veteran commanders into a panic, and they therefore took the decision to seize Dresden, the capital of Napoleon's ally, the King of Saxony. The coalition leaders decided on this course because they happened to be close to Dresden, and they wanted to take at least one important strategic location before the dreaded French emperor arrived on the scene. The decision was fateful not least because Schwarzenberg's Allied army was advancing over very difficult terrain. Most of their columns were moving through mountainous areas where the road gradient was seldom less than 15 degrees, or 1 foot of elevation gain for every 4 feet of horizontal distance. Marching for days along sloping ground such as this exhausted both men and animals, and increased their caloric needs, so that ordinary portions of supplies left them hungry. The turn towards Dresden made the situation worse. The march on Leipzig, though up a 15-degree slope, followed the slope of the land, and thus the roads were relatively smooth. Swinging towards Dresden caused the Schwarzenberg's force to move at right angles to its original course. climbing and descending the sides of alternate ridges and valleys rather than moving along them. The Allied army reached the environs of Dresden on August 25th, already reeling with fatigue before a single shot was fired. The commanders decided to allow their men to rest overnight and attack the city late on the afternoon of the following day, August 26th, 1813. Napoleon, meanwhile, was not idle. He had been planning on an advance towards Prague, but news of the Allied movement towards Leipzig, eventually diverted to Dresden, caused him to change his mind. The threat of an army of 200,000 men was too much for the emperor to ignore, and accordingly, he sent Marshal MacDonald, a French commander of Scottish descent, with about 100,000 men to push into Silesia. This maneuver was to prevent the doughty Prussian commander von Blucher from attacking Napoleon in the flank as he moved to intercept Field Marshal Schwarzenberg. Von Blucher was maneuvering at the head of 115,000 men, and Napoleon tasked MacDonald with keeping him at bay. Napoleon then led the elite Young Guard to Stolpen, where he could intercept Schwarzenberg's Allied forces, whether they moved towards Leipzig or Dresden, as he explained in a letter to the Parisian newspapers instructing them to prepare for publication of news about fresh French victories. Either the enemy has taken his line of operations by Peterswald to Dresden. In that case, I shall be with my united army in his rear, and it will take him 4 to 5 days to concentrate. Or he has gone by the road from Komatau to Leipzig, then he will retire on Komatau, and I shall be nearer to Prague than he is, and shall march there. While Napoleon was at Stolpen, one of his cavalry officers arrived to inform him that Schwarzenberg's huge army was poised to take Dresden the following day. Napoleon immediately issued orders for all available forces to concentrate at the city, and he set out at 4 a.m. in the morning at the head of the Young Guard to form the backbone of resistance. Meanwhile, Schwarzenberg and other members of the coalition army's high command rode forward to study Dresden some 5 hours after Napoleon left Stolpen. The royalty and senior officers who made up the party took up a position on high ground overlooking the future scene of action, but they did not remain there long before, through the veil of mist which still lay over the valley, a great cheer of Vive l'Empereur surged out of the town, and in a moment the words "too late" were on everyone's lips. Only the King of Prussia stood out, emphasizing the point that for an army of 200,000 men to back down before the mere threat of a shout was unprecedented. It could hardly be called war at all. Dresden, where the clash between Napoleon and Schwarzenberg occurred later that afternoon, was a moderately sized provincial capital at that time, with modest and somewhat poorly arranged defensive earthworks. The city occupied both banks of the river Elbe, which had carved the valley through millions of years of erosion. A single bridge connected Dresden's two halves, though this was of stone, and therefore difficult for either an attacker or a defender to demolish quickly with the munitions of the early 19th century. The coalition army had planned a 5-column attack against the city, but now some of the commanders want to withdraw. Alexander I of Russia, present on the scene, argued in favor of falling back due to Napoleon's presence, but the Prussian king Frederick Wilhelm III heaped scorn on this suggestion and urged an assault regardless of the French emperor's presence. A lengthy, heated argument erupted at Schwarzenberg's headquarters, which the sound of cannon fire finally interrupted. Farcically, the coalition leaders forgot to countermand the attack orders issued to the junior commanders the night before, and these men, obedient to a plan that they did not know was likely to be discarded, began their cannonade and advance on Dresden punctually, despite the lack of additional orders from their general. The battle's commencement forced the commanders to accept it as their de facto plan, and attempt to carry it out even in the teeth of the alarming French emperor. The advancing soldiers found that Dresden, though not heavily fortified, provided an excellent defensive position due to the sturdy houses and numerous walled gardens taking advantage of the rich Elbe floodplain soil. The critical action on the battlefield took place south of the river Elbe in the old city of Dresden and was characterized by desperate house-to-house fighting. Walls held up many of the Austrian columns of assault, because they had not brought assault ladders. Meanwhile, more French troops arrived by the hour, many after forced marches. Napoleon rapidly reinforced St. Cyr's excellent defenses with portions of the Young Guard. The French position became more and more robust as August 26th proceeded, and by nightfall 70,000 men were deployed to hold the city. It is axiomatic in warfare that 3 times as many attackers as there are defenders must be present in order to successfully assault prepared defensive positions. However, even though Schwarzenberg's army totaled 200,000 men and was nominally sufficient to overcome Napoleon's 70,000, many men were still struggling along difficult roads, listening to the dull rumble of artillery in the distance, but still too far away to assist. On August 27th, Schwarzenberg's combined army of Austrians, Prussians, and Russians formed up for a fresh assault, with a massive central column and 2 extended wings of cavalry and infantry to defend its flanks. However, Napoleon surveyed their positions, and when the unexpected happened, seized the initiative before the enemy could advance over the corpse-littered valley floor to Dresden again. A sudden storm broke over the battlefield, drenching the landscape in a downpour of stupefying force. The Austrian infantry on the left wing suddenly heard the sound of bugles blowing and the rising tidal thunder of thousands of hooves pounding the sodden earth, rolling loudly and ominously even above the drumming rain. Their officers, experienced men who knew how to defend against cavalry, bellowed orders, and the white-coated infantry formed into bristling squares, ready to meet the French horsemen bearing down on them. French infantry appeared out of the rain, bayonets fixed as they moved forward in grimly determined ranks. The waves of horsemen, nearly 9,000 strong, passed around the extreme left at an earth-shaking canter, formed up behind the enemy infantry squares, and then charged with a deafening roar of "Vive l'Empereur!" At their head rode the flamboyant, gleaming Marat, unmistakable even with his brilliant finery soaked in rainwater. The Austrians waited until the French were close, and then leveled their muskets for a devastating barrage. However, instead of a sheet of lethal fire, a feeble scatter of shots ensued as most of the muskets, soaked by the furious downpour, misfired. The French cavalry crashed headlong into the squares, and because of the muskets' uselessness, square after square was broken. The Austrian cavalry, coming to the rescue of the infantry, was charged by the French cuirassiers and routed. The fight had begun at 10 o'clock, and by 2 the whole Austrian left was thoroughly broken up. Marat had taken 30 guns and 12,000 prisoners, and more than 4,000 of the enemy had been killed and wounded. Napoleon had proven his keen military insight again. The sudden rainstorm made him realize that the Austrians' gunpowder would be soaked and that they were extraordinarily vulnerable to cavalry. Marat carried out his attack with impeccable dash and precision, breaking an entire wing of Schwarzenberg's army and capturing 15 banners. At the same time, French forces engaged the opposite wing to keep the coalition army off balance. Alexander I was standing in the headquarters tent when a French cannonball ripped through the canvas and blew the high-ranking officer standing next to him to pieces. This understandably compelled the Russian monarch to issue orders to fall back. Napoleon was on the verge of commanding his men in an encircling movement that would likely have captured much of Schwarzenberg's army, plus the sovereigns of Prussia and Russia, but he suddenly began writhing in agony and vomiting. His ailing stomach could not support remaining outside in cold and rain for the past 24 hours. So the emperor rode back into Dresden and allowed Schwarzenberg to withdraw, though Marat did collect an additional 6,000 prisoners. The French had been outnumbered nearly 2-1 at Dresden, and even after their victory, they remained heavily outnumbered. The Sixth Coalition was capable of putting 1 million men into fields across Europe, and Napoleon couldn't possibly defend the entire French Empire against that number. Duke Wellington once famously said, "Napoleon alone was worth 50,000 men in the field, but even genius had to give way to the laws of mathematics, and there was little Napoleon could do about the fact that he was consistently outnumbered by 2 or 3-1. Napoleon had defied odds while commanding seasoned veterans, but most of those men had been lost on the plains of Russia. Schwarzenberg lost about 38,000 men killed, wounded, and captured, while French losses amounted to 10,000. However, bad news for the French was not long delayed. Marshal MacDonald had blundered into von Blucher's forces at Katzbach on the 26th, and taken by surprise during a massive thunderstorm much as the Austrians were at Dresden, was soundly beaten, losing 13,000 killed and wounded and 20,000 prisoners while inflicting a mere 4,000 casualties on the Prussians in return. The pattern of victory where Napoleon commanded and defeat where his marshals led without him had reasserted itself, and more disasters followed. Marshals Vandamme and Auguste de Marmont attacked the coalition at the Battle of Culm and were soundly defeated on August 30th. Marshal Vandamme was taken prisoner and brought to Alexander I, who upbraided him as a bandit and looter. Vandamme defiantly rejected these charges and added that regardless of his depiction in history books, he would at least escape the opprobrium of a patricide's reputation. He directed this barb at the Tsar because that monarch's father, Paul I, was strangled and kicked to death by assassins practically in Alexander's presence, and contemporaries believed that Alexander had arranged the murder personally. At this point, Oudinot's resentment at his demotion caused another setback for the French. A force under Ney, which included Oudinot, encountered a force of Prussians, Swedes, and Austrian militia at Dennewitz on September 5th, and in a series of protracted encounters, Ney advanced aggressively and managed to push back several coalition units. However, the critical moment arrived when Ney's flanking force, the 7th Corps, asked Oudinot to reinforce them due to a heavy attack. Oudinot ignored the plea and continued to march on precisely the route Ney had given him earlier, showing his rage and contempt by following his orders to the letter, even when he knew the result would be catastrophic. The disaster was not slow in coming. Almost as the last of the 12th Corps quit the line, the storm burst upon the exhausted 7th Corps. An advance of every available gun to case-shot range preluded the approach of a perfect hurricane of horsemen before whom the French broke. A wild panic seized the French, and for the next few days, Ney's command ceased to exist. Following the defeat of Ney at Dennewitz, and understanding all too well that the action would cement Austrian resolve to remain as part of the hostile 6th Coalition, Napoleon's nerves were stretched to the snapping point. As he rode with his staff, seething, and with French fugitives passing him begging for food, he was unable to give due to von Blucher's recent raiding success against his supply convoys. The Emperor lost his usual self-control. A miserable dog ran out and yapped at his horse as he rode by. He drew his pistol on the poor wretch, but the pistol misfired, and in a rage he flung it at the animal. Then he rode on in gloomy silence. Napoleon gathered his scattered forces and moved to meet von Blucher, who was advancing after defeating MacDonald at Katzbach. MacDonald himself, and several other commanders, received stunning dressings down as Napoleon encountered them along his route. His leading elements met those of Blucher's army of Silesia near Hochkirch, near the Lobau River. The Emperor ordered his men forward against the coalition soldiery aggressively, but the French attacked with such vigor that Blucher and his generals immediately detected the presence of the master and at once ordered a retreat behind the Lobau River. Von Blucher, despite his intense hatred of Napoleon, was too cautious to give battle when the initiative lay with the French. During the rest of September, the French and coalition maneuvered for advantage, frequently through cold and rainy weather. The opponents fought several actions, though none was decisive, and each side enjoyed mixed success. Napoleon found his supply lines harassed by the Cossacks whom Alexander I had brought with him from Russia, augmented by the efforts of German partisans. The coalition army also carried out long cavalry raids into the French-held areas of Germany, a radical departure from the usual European strategy of the time. Unlike American cavalry, which was used during the mid-19th century as a long-range independent strike force due to the vast spaces of the North American continent, Napoleonic armies generally kept their cavalry forces within 10 to 20 miles of the nearest infantry formation. The German population, who often willingly supplied food and fodder to these horsemen, likely made the unusual flying columns of the 1813 campaign feasible. The two sides marched back and forth endlessly during the rest of September and into early October. The coalition was unwilling to close yet with Napoleon, and for his part, the emperor lacked the men to defend all of his remaining German possessions, yet he seemed unable to let go of them. Instead, he rushed from point to point, trying to keep control of this eastern extension of his empire, even though such efforts were ultimately futile without a major victory in the field. One major blow to Napoleon's cause was the defection of Bavaria on October 8th, which placed a hostile force of 50,000 men in his rear between him and his supply and communication lines to France. The coalition, whose generals had studiously been avoiding battle with Napoleon after their thrashing at Dresden, now guessed that Napoleon would retreat at least as far as the Rhine River, and they accelerated their advance on Leipzig, an important city they now believed the French emperor would not defend. In that judgment, they guessed incorrectly. Instead, Napoleon gathered all the forces he could, including the cavalry of La Tour Marbourg and Marat, and moved boldly towards Leipzig in hopes of forcing an encounter. The maneuver succeeded, though the outcome would not be the one Napoleon sought. The stage was now set for the historic Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, to occur, and at this juncture, Napoleon made a serious error which ultimately cost him the support of Saxony. Perhaps recalling Barclay de Tolly's success in carrying out a scorched earth policy in Russia and seeking to turn the tables on his opponents by emulating their actions, the French emperor took actions that inflicted more harm on his own political arrangements than on the advancing armies of the coalition. The antipathy towards Napoleon and his multi-ethnic army reached its highest point in the weeks before the battle. One reason was Napoleon's order that his retreating troops should take all of the inhabitants' livestock, burn the forests, hack down the orchards, and destroy all other means of nourishment, in order to deprive these regions of every possible means of livelihood and transform them into a desert. Though the destruction impacted the coalition forces to some degree, their supply lines were much shorter and considerably more secure than those of the French during their invasion of Russia. The opposing armies did not remain near Leipzig for an extended time prior to their battlefield encounter either, rendering the scorched earth even more moot from the perspective of what Napoleon hoped to achieve. However, the French devastation had an important effect on the campaign's military outcome, albeit not the one that Napoleon anticipated. This policy was one reason for the defection of Saxon troops during the Battle of Leipzig. They refused to participate in the destruction of their homeland, thereby defying their king, who stood by Napoleon only to be deposed by the coalition after his defeat at Leipzig. Once again, the same forces of nationalism and patriotism he helped to awaken all across the European continent baffled Napoleon. The Saxon army effectively voted their king out of office by siding with those determined to remove him from his throne. Before that could happen, however, it was necessary to defeat the formidable and still very active Napoleon. Leipzig. The first action of the Battle of Leipzig, though sometimes labeled an entirely separate battle by historians, occurred at Liebertwolkwitz on October 14th. Napoleon held Leipzig and its environs, while the coalition army, led by a cumbersome supreme command consisting of 3 monarchs who held equal shares in overall decision-making, converged on the city from several directions. The first to arrive was the Army of Bohemia, approaching Leipzig from the south, with its leading elements commanded by the Russian general Wittgenstein. Schwarzenberg led this portion of the army overall, while von Blucher led a separate army approaching from the north. Opposing the advancing Wittgenstein were infantry under the extremely dashing and capable Polish commander Marshal Józef Poniatowski, who had once personally saved Schwarzenberg's life during the storming of Sabak, a Serbian town held by Ottoman Turks. A heavy concentration of artillery backed up the infantry, and the French southern flank possessed a major offensive asset in the form of 10,000 cavalry commanded by Marat. His forces consisted of the 2nd, 5th, and 8th Corps, comprising over 32,000 infantry between them. and the 4th and 5th Cavalry Corps, a Guards cavalry division, and several smaller units, making up almost 10,000 cavalry in all. 156 cannons supported his men. The coalition forces numbered just a few thousand when the first shots were fired, but more arrived steadily during the morning and into the early afternoon, including infantry, artillery, and 23 regiments of cavalry to oppose to Murat's 18 regiments. Though heavy infantry fighting and artillery bombardment occurred, Leibert-Volkwitz became noted as the largest cavalry battle to occur during the Napoleonic Wars. Wittgenstein initially believed that the French were retreating from Leipzig, not concentrating there, and mistook Murat's formidable force for a much smaller rearguard that he could easily brush aside. In fact, the battle was destined to be the scene of another and even more protracted struggle on October 16th, just 2 days later. The terrain surrounding the French position consisted largely of gentle slopes coming up to flat-topped hills. Thanks to recent heavy rain, the ground, particularly in the hollows, was wet and muddy, which hindered movement. The plateau stretching from Leibert-Volkwitz to Guldengosse and Wachau was about 1,400 paces wide. The highest point, the Galgenberg or Gallows Hill, was an excellent artillery position. Marat observed the battlefield from the summit of Gallows Hill, which also furnished the place for the main batteries of French artillery. The position he held along the southern fringe of Leipzig was a strong defensive location, and offered some possibilities for attack as well. A line of villages and hills provided a natural fortification for the French, while the coalition troops were obliged to move forward over open ground with no cover from artillery fire. His gigantic force of cavalry lurked out of sight behind Gallows Hill's bulk, ready to pounce when the moment seemed ripe for a counter-offensive. Wittgenstein recognized Gallows Hill as a key position, since it commanded the entire approach to Leipzig from the south, and providing an excellent observation point as well, and at 11 a.m., he sent 2 Russian hussar regiments forward towards this eminence. The light horsemen advanced up the open slopes in full view of the French artillerists waiting on the crest above them. When they came within range, the French met them with a furious bombardment that soon forced them to retreat, leaving the ground dotted with dead men and horses. 2 French cavalry divisions trotted around Gallows Hill and moved down the slope in pursuit of the retreating hussars. A 3rd Russian hussar regiment, the Sumy Hussars, carried out a furious charge against the leading French regiment, throwing it back some distance. However, the following French regiments forced the Sumy Hussars to retreat in turn. The Prussian Neumark Dragoons in their tall cylindrical hats charged forward, supported by Silesian Uhlans, lancers, and the French retreated yet again. Such seesaw actions were typical of cavalry battles during the Napoleonic Wars. As a charge was made, struck the enemy, flung them back, and then ran out of momentum, creating an opportunity for a countercharge and so forth. As the Prussian Neumark Dragoons, Silesian Uhlans, Sumy Hussars, and East Prussian cuirassiers pressed hard upon the withdrawing French, Murat and additional French cavalry attacked them and swept them back. The brilliantly uniformed marshal stood out even in the ranks of colorful cavalry, and as the struggling mass of men and horses rolled southward down the slope amid the slash of sabers, the crack of pistols, and the thrust of lances, Murat was recognized. At one point he was cut off and nearly taken prisoner. "Rends-toi, Roy!" "Give up, king!" shouted a Prussian officer, threatening him with his sword point. Murat's orderly ran the Prussian through, and a party of French horsemen came to the rescue. This man, Second Lieutenant Guido von der Lippe of the Neumark Dragoons, likely hoped to achieve a kingly reward for capturing such a prominent French commander. Instead, he achieved posthumous historical fame commemorated in a painting of the incident. The Prussian appears to have approached Murat from the left rear, adroitly putting the marshal at a huge disadvantage, since it was nearly impossible for the Frenchman to bring his sword to bear in that quarter. However, the orderly adopted the same maneuver, approaching the Prussian from the left rear and stabbing him fatally in the back. After the cavalry retreated to their own lines, the Austrian general Johann von Klenau led an attack on the village of Leibert-Volkwitz. A capable man then in his late 50s, Klenau deployed his soldiers carefully. Skirmishers led the way ahead of his white-coated assault columns, and cavalry screens protected their flanks against surprise. The French infantry fired over the garden walls and from the houses of Liebert-Volkwitz, but when it became clear that the Austrians were overrunning the town, the local French commander ordered the civilian inhabitants to flee to Leipzig, lest they be killed in the street fighting. After a ferocious struggle, the Austrians pushed the French out of the village and pushed forward excitedly to the other side, only to find that Murat had deployed a number of his cannon to block them. Blasted by canister, grape, and round shot, the Austrians hastily pulled back inside Liebert-Volkwitz, making its massive stone church the center of their defense. Another cavalry battle ensued, in which the French marshal narrowly eluded capture yet again. The French fell back, and the Prussians swarmed up Gallows Hill, chopping and slashing at those artillerymen who did not immediately flee. Had the Prussian and Austrian cavalry pushed forward, they might have broken the French line, but they stopped in an effort to hitch the French cannons to their horses in order to drag them away. A combined force of French infantry and cavalry caught the coalition horsemen disordered, distracted, and partly dismounted, and swept them from Gallows Hill, recapturing all the cannons. At about 2:30 p.m., Murat led a huge cavalry charge forward towards the main coalition body, and though it was carried out with great dash and personal courage, he handled the maneuver clumsily. Rather than moving forward in versatile, highly mobile squadrons, the marshal deployed his cavalry in two ponderous columns, which were unable to maneuver. The Prussian, Silesian, Austrian, and Russian cavalry slipped adroitly out of the way, and keeping their mobility with smaller individual formations, slashed viciously at the lumbering column's flanks. Eventually the French were forced to pull back. Though Murat had blundered, Wittgenstein did also. Klenau, holding Liebert-Volkwitz, sent him repeated messages asking for reinforcements, but the coalition commander ignored them all. Accordingly, when French infantry advanced on the village at 4 p.m. and eventually forced the Austrians to retreat after another brutal close-range struggle, the French isolated a band of several hundred Austrians in the church and cut them down almost to a man. This structure still survives and now contains a monument to the men who died within its walls. The battle trailed off amid skirmishing, while medical personnel collected the wounded and sent them into Leipzig. The coalition had lost about 2,000 men in the indecisive, though vigorously contested action, and the French suffered at least as many casualties. The following day was largely free of fighting, as each side continued to muster reinforcements, and Napoleon appeared personally on Gallows Hill to hand out medals to the bravest fighters from the previous day. Prince Eugene, one of the commanders of Wittgenstein's force, amused himself for a time by watching the French emperor through his telescope. After a pause on October 15th, the fighting around Leipzig resumed on the 16th. Some historians describe the day as gloomy and rainy, but the testimony of an officer in von Blücher's Northern Army directly contradicts this picture. The day was bright and mild. It is remarkable that every engagement in which I have been present has taken place in the finest weather. Either way, Napoleon's army numbered about 190,000 men with 752 cannons, while the Allies mustered no less than 495,000 men and 1,000 cannons, though only a portion of these had reached the field and the rest were still en route. In essence, October 16th represented Napoleon's best chance at achieving something like a victory since the full weight of the enemy's numbers were not yet bearing on his position. Each day of delay brought more coalition forces to the field and reduced the French emperor's chances of winning. The Battle of October 16th occurred chiefly on two fronts, the northwest and the south. On the south, Schwarzenberg arrived to take overall command, leaving Wittgenstein as an important subordinate, but a subordinate nonetheless. The center of the fighting on this flank was once more to be Gallows Hill, and in particular the two villages flanking it, Liebert-Volkwitz and Wachau. Napoleon guessed that a relatively small force could hold his northwestern flank against von Blücher, while he could send many of his men against the army in the south. The coalition attack was to consist of 5 columns, stretched out over 6 miles of countryside, and therefore completely out of visual contact with one another. Two columns were to attack Liebertwolkwitz, one of 33,000 men under Klenau from the east, and one from the south under the leadership of Gorchakov, numbering 9,000 soldiers. One column was ordered to attack Gallows Hill, that of the Russian general Podlin, with 5,400 cavalry, and two columns aimed at the village of Wachau, those of Prince Eugene, 11,000 strong, and Kleist, 8,400 strong. The reserve force consisted of 10,500 Russian grenadier infantry and armored cuirassier cavalry. The overall commander of the attack was the Scottish-Russian general Barclay de Tolly. Napoleon personally assumed command of the forces to the south of Leipzig, arriving in a coach escorted by Guards cavalry and meeting up with Murat. The emperor made a long and careful study of the battlefield through his glass. He saw that the enemy had anticipated the attack he himself intended, and that his own corps were by no means all up. Accordingly, he sent reinforcements to the points most threatened. Tsar Alexander I, meanwhile, surveyed the same ground using his own telescope from a hilltop to the south. The canny monarch sensed disaster in the fragmented deployment, whose columns were isolated and thus unable to support each other. So he ordered the 10,500 strong Russian reserve of cuirassiers and grenadiers forward immediately, and sent urgent messages to Schwarzenberg, farther to the south, to move reinforcements up as quickly as possible. Prince Eugene led his column into Wachau at 9:30 a.m., beginning the action in earnest. His cheering soldiers drove the French out of the village, but the blue-coated infantry of Napoleon soon returned with fresh determination. A savage struggle swayed back and forth through the town and its environs over the next hour and a half, at the end of which Eugene felt obliged to withdraw. He did not move back far, however, deploying his men in a fold in the ground, which protected them from most of the French fire. He ordered them to continue firing at Wachau. In this way, he hoped to occupy the French so that they could neither turn the flank nor strip Wachau of men to reinforce their line elsewhere. Kleist's column supported him from the village of Markkleeberg, though an attempt to attack Wachau from there fell back after the French mowed down many of the attacking soldiers. Gorchakov botched his attack on Liebertwolkwitz, but Klenau managed to take it once again, just as he had on the 14th. However, he was soon expelled again by elements of the elite French Young Guard and Old Guard under Oudinot, now acting more normally again, and Marshal MacDonald. By 2 p.m., the columns had all been repulsed except for Kleist's shaky foothold in Markkleeberg. Reinforcements were coming, but had not arrived in time to offer support to the initial push. Napoleon sensed the moment for attack had arrived, and his plan was one he had used quite often before: penetrating the enemy's center to divide their force into two separate, half-sized armies that could not support or even communicate with each other, then smash them in detail. He planned an assault by the Old Guard and Young Guard supported by massive quantities of cannon fire, and several heavy charges by armored cuirassier divisions opened this phase of the battle. An attack by Saxon cuirassiers pushed Kleist's men out of Markkleeberg, though they managed to retreat in good order thanks to courageous support from their own attached cavalry. This, however, was only preparation for the main cavalry thrust. General Pomereux led forward a division of elite French cuirassiers who mowed down Prince Eugene's column in short order, turning the unit's defensive hollow into a blood-drenched grave and capturing 26 cannons before thundering forward against the coalition center. In this charge, they very nearly killed or captured Tsar Alexander I and King Frederick Wilhelm III. Hewing down the enemy right and left as they passed, the cuirassiers arrived at some ponds in front of the Wachtburg, on which were Alexander and the King of Prussia. But the French charge was nearly spent. As they struggled to get forward between the ponds, they were charged by the Cossack escort, and on the left flank by 13 squadrons of Russian cuirassiers. The whole division was driven back in confusion behind Drouot, whose grape fire finally brought the pursuit to an end. Napoleon nevertheless sent forward his infantry. A lengthy struggle ensued, but the French were unable to break through. The reinforcements Napoleon had expected from the northern edge of the city did not arrive, because von Blucher had proven harder to stave off than anticipated. Meanwhile, further reinforcements arrived for the coalition forces, steadily stiffening their line as the afternoon wore on. The French retreated at dusk, leaving the opponents in precisely the same positions they occupied at dawn, except with thousands more dead and wounded. Napoleon's plan failed mostly due to Alexander's timely message to send reserves forward post-haste. If the Tsar had not grasped the situation and acted to rectify it, the French might well have routed the southern army, then brought their full force to bear on von Blucher and defeated him in turn, prolonging the German war and possibly causing the Allies to sue for peace on terms highly favorable to Napoleon. While action in the south was inconclusive, at Lindenau and Mockern to the north of Leipzig, Gyulai and von Blucher attacked the French. Blucher could clearly hear the crash of artillery and the dull roar of musketry from the southern edge of the city, so he decided on a bold attack at 10 a.m. in the morning to prevent the French from sending reinforcements to the action there. This plan worked, as Marshal Marmont, who started moving towards the south with 20,000 men, ultimately wheeled around to counter von Blucher at Mockern. Von Blucher sent 21,000 men, supported by 88 guns, against the key town of Mockern. General Ludwig Yorck von Wartenberg commanded this force, and Marmont brought his 20,000 to bear against Mockern in turn. Though fighting occurred all along the line, the centerpiece of the mayhem was Mockern. The Prussians initially took the town, but Marmont soon ejected them. Yorck sent infantry attack after infantry attack against the position, supported by the incessant fire of his 88 cannons, yet Marmont held them off. The French Marines in their tall shakos with red plumes, elite soldiers toughened by years of fighting, proved especially dangerous in the struggle. Blasts of musketry shredded the Prussian ranks, and they reeled back from the French bayonets, reformed, and attacked repeatedly, until they were decimated and utterly exhausted. With nightfall approaching, Yorck was desperate to achieve a breakthrough. Mounting his horse, the sharp-featured, white-haired general personally led a regiment of Prussian-Lithuanian dragoons, supported by all his remaining cavalry, into the town. Such was the force of their charge that they swept aside all resistance, capturing 35 cannons, 2 colors, 5 ammunition wagons, and 400 prisoners. Marmont was able to fall back to Gohlis unmolested. Losses in this battle were fearful. Yorck's corps, which had borne the brunt of the fighting, had started the day with nearly 21,000 men. At the end of the day, 5,600 had become casualties. Marmont, by his own count, lost anywhere up to 7,000 men, and at least 6,000 during the day. Each force suffered between 25% and 33% casualties, but the most important aspect of the battle is that von Blucher managed to keep the French pinned, while Napoleon's attack tapered off in the south due to lack of reinforcements. The Prussian general's achievements earned a promotion to the rank of Field Marshal before October 16th ended. Of course, von Blucher had no precise information on what was happening to the south, since the two forces were separated by miles of terrain and city, swarming with hostile soldiers in an era before radios. But his instincts proved sufficient to the task in hand. His attack, though costly, swung the battle decisively in favor of the coalition, because time was working on the Allies' side. As more and more of their troops arrived on the battlefield, Napoleon's Saxon allies began to desert him. Only a few minor actions occurred on October 17th, as both sides were exhausted by the prolonged struggles of the 16th, and both the French and the coalition received fresh reinforcements. The Allies welcomed an additional 145,000 soldiers to their encampments, while a mere 14,000 men trickled in to aid Napoleon's efforts. The French emperor, sensing that defeat loomed over the Grande Armee, sent a captured general back to the coalition commanders with a peace offer. This document suggested an armistice in which Napoleon would surrender a large portion, but not all of his German possessions, and retreat behind the Saale River. A more permanent peace, he suggested, might then be negotiated. The Allies, distrusting Napoleon's peaceful intentions and perceiving a reasonable chance of victory, refused. On the 18th, the fighting resumed, and this time it truly reached a crescendo. The day was not notable for interesting tactics or maneuvers because the Allies, knowing that Napoleon was far superior to them in a battle of maneuver, set about methodically crushing him in a bloody but inexorable grip. The coalition army was now so numerous that it could form a continuous cordon around three sides of Leipzig, the north, east, and south. Only in the west did rivers prevent the Allies from encircling Napoleon, and it was in this direction that the French would eventually escape. The day was brilliantly dry and sunny, which had hideous consequences when several villages caught fire and the blazes spread unimpeded by rain. The coalition's plan was simply to advance against Leipzig from all sides, crushing the French inwards and forcing their retreat or capitulation. The French fought stubbornly and with great courage, but the Allies gradually drove them inward as the hours passed by, and the assault continued. Napoleon himself led wherever possible, earning the grudging plaudits of an enemy officer, who later wrote, "Napoleon himself led on the attack. He then brought a half-dispirited army to meet an immensely superior force, yet his great mind still had power to animate his troops. He knew the greatness of the stakes. His soldiers fought daringly as if sure of victory. I must pay the homage of admiration of a hero who made his effort for existence with such daring courage." Von Blucher pushed into the northern suburbs of Leipzig, but the French fought for every house, every street, and every walled garden, strewing the ground with dead and wounded Prussians. The Russians on the south and east showed great valor as well, though they could make little headway against the iron-willed defenders at what might be called Napoleon's last stand. Though the Allies threatened encirclement several times, the French managed to keep the western approaches to the city open, leaving them with a route of retreat should the battle go against them. Some of the day's most intense fighting occurred around the village of Probstheide, where Russian forces under Barclay de Tolly met French soldiers under Marshal MacDonald. Echoing events at Liebertwolkwitz and Mockern, the two sides ejected one another repeatedly from the ravaged town. Matters turned decisively against the Russians when the conflagration reached its height due to several bizarre accidents, as a French eyewitness reported. Many wounded on both sides were burnt to death, and in the manor farm all the cattle perished, even the huge black bull. Maddened by all the firing and yelling and by burns, the bull had broken loose and ran against the attacking Russians so irresistibly that on his own he scattered an entire column. The burning church tower made common cause with the raging bull to defeat the Russians. It collapsed and buried a large number of these soldiers beneath its ruins. MacDonald managed to hold this key point until the coalition attack finally ceased for the night, though the soldiers had struggled in a hellish, fire-streaked quasi-darkness during much of the day as it was. According to the same eyewitness, the smoke, dust, and fumes made the day so dark that nobody could tell what time of day it was. Elsewhere along the line, Marshal Poniatowski's gallant Poles gave a good account of themselves, though Poniatowski sustained several wounds over the course of the afternoon. The final act of the drama occurred on the following day, October 19th. Napoleon knew by the end of the 18th that his defeat was inevitable, unless he retreated westward and used the Elster River to block Allied efforts at pursuit. Several Saxon and other German units defected from Napoleon's army during the 18th, and while they were relatively few in number and did not significantly weaken his force, they indicated to him that none of his German allies could be relied on to stand with the losing French. Accordingly, the French began to withdraw on the morning of the 19th as soon as there was enough light to permit a safe crossing of the single bridge over the Elster, and a powerful rearguard under MacDonald and Poniatowski deployed to keep the coalition army at bay. The event proved this a prudent arrangement, for von Blucher and Barclay de Tolly ordered a massive assault as soon as they noted the French crossing the river. Their hopes were pinned on putting an end to the Emperor for the last time, capturing the whole remnant of the Grande Armee, and making Napoleon a prisoner. Von Blucher was itching to shoot or hang the French Emperor, though the three monarchs on the field would likely have countermanded such an order. The Allied forces hastened forward to hurl themselves desperately on the French, attempting to block their withdrawal, but MacDonald's and Poniatowski's men fought doggedly to keep the bridge open, and much of the French army succeeded in crossing to the west bank of the Elster. Making a crossing in the teeth of Napoleon holding the far shore was more daring than even von Blucher was willing to exhibit. So the opportunity to end the war would last only as long as most of the French were still on the eastern bank. It was at this moment that random chance intervened again. The bridge over the Elster was filled with explosives so that it could be destroyed once the rearguard crossed. However, this delicate matter rested in the hands of a lone sergeant of engineers left with responsibility to ignite the charge on the appearance of opposing forces. The sergeant interpreted his orders literally. When nothing more than a small body of Prussian riflemen appeared on the opposite riverbank, he blew the bridge prematurely, cutting Napoleon's army in two and inflicting more damage on his remaining forces than the previous 3 days' fighting. With one thunderous blast of erupting gunpowder, 57,000 men became stranded on the eastern bank, including 2 marshals, MacDonald and Poniatowski. The Allies pressed home their attack, and the French began surrendering in droves, with around 50,000 prisoners taken and nearly 7,000 killed or drowned while trying to cross the rain-swollen Elster. One of the latter was Poniatowski, who, like MacDonald, felt horror at the thought of capture. Both men would have been treated with the utmost decorum and respect, well lodged, and given excellent food and wine had they been captured by the Allies, who still operated by 18th-century norms of civilized warfare. However, the shame of being a Marshal of France taken by the enemy due to a mere accident was too much for them to bear. Poniatowski jumped his horse into the Elster to try to swim across, but the raging brown waters separated him from his animal. The Polish marshal attempted to swim, but the wounds he had sustained weakened him, and he was sucked under the muddy, churning surface to die. MacDonald attempted a different route across the river when he discovered a makeshift bridge made by soldiers who had laid 2 parallel tree trunks across the stream. He later explained, "It was my only chance. I made up my mind and risked it. I got off my horse with great difficulty, owing to the crowd. And there I was, 1 foot on either trunk, and the abyss below me. A high wind was blowing. I had already made 3/4 of my way across, when some men determined to follow me. Their unsteady feet caused the trunks to shake, and I fell into the water. I could fortunately touch the bottom, but the bank was steep, the soil loose and greasy. I vainly struggled to reach the shore." MacDonald eventually managed to drag himself out, exhausted and bedraggled, on the west bank. But behind him, the last action of the Battle of Leipzig was ending as the French laid down their weapons and surrendered. 38,000 French were killed and wounded, another 50,000 captured, and 5,000 Saxons and other Germans had gone over to the enemy. The coalition paid a steep price of 55,000 men killed and wounded for their victory, but Napoleon had been decisively defeated. The defeat at Leipzig, though not as crushing as it might have been, rendered Napoleon's position in Germany untenable. The Grande Armee retreated behind the Rhine River and would never again operate on German soil. Forced to retreat westward, he fell back into France, leaving the Saxon city to his enemies. As a source from the time describes, the triumphant coalition forces received a hero's welcome as they entered Leipzig after the departure of the French. Filled with patriotic fervor, the Saxons hailed those who had driven out Napoleon, restored their city's liberty, and soon would dethrone their unpopular king for his support of the French emperor. A protracted cheer rang out from 1,000 throats to greet the Russian and Prussian monarchs, who were the first to enter the city. White cloths waved from all the windows. It was an overwhelming spectacle when the Allies with Prince Schwarzenberg and the highest officers of the victorious armies passed through Grimmaesch to the marketplace at the head of their guards, to the sound of martial music. The coalition continued to offer Napoleon peace terms that would have left him with some semblance of power and independence, but the French emperor stubbornly refused them all. France was now an island in a storm. British, Spanish, and Portuguese armies pressed through the Pyrenees in the south and attacked Bordeaux, while Russians, Austrians, and Prussians closed in from the north and west. Napoleon lashed out, winning a series of minor victories inside France proper, but he was powerless in the face of ever-growing enemy forces. The barrel of French conscription had been scraped dry, and there were no more troops to be had. When the Allies invaded France with 500,000 men, Napoleon could only muster some 70,000. In March of 1814, the Allied forces took Paris. Napoleon hoped to use the remnants of his army to attack the coalition forces in Paris itself, but his generals threatened mutiny. A few days later, under considerable pressure from his marshals, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. At first, he attempted to secure the succession for his young son by Marie-Louise, but this was refused by the coalition, whose rulers were still European royalty and fully intended to ensure the restoration of the ousted Bourbons in France. His efforts to mobilize 900,000 soldiers against the invaders were a dismal failure, leading to his abdication on April 6, 1814. With that, Napoleon found himself on the losing end of a treaty for the first time. The terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau denied him and his heirs any claim to the throne of France, assigned his wife and son to the Austrian court, and banished Napoleon himself, with a small honor guard, to the small island of Elba, a lick of land home to about 10,000 inhabitants off the Italian coast. Napoleon, seemingly resigned to his fate, bid an extremely moving farewell to his veterans of the Old Guard, which left many of the hardened soldiers in tears. Having bid his most loyal soldiers goodbye, Napoleon took ship for his exile in Elba. Escape and advance. Although Napoleon was exiled, he was allowed to retain the title of emperor and was given de facto control over Elba. But it is not surprising the man who once ruled Europe was not content with the island of Elba. Separated from his family and cast away on a small island, Napoleon attempted suicide by taking a poison pill. However, he had first carried the pill with him on the retreat from Moscow, rightly concerned about an uncertain fate at the time. The age of the pill had fatally weakened the pill, which stopped it from fatally weakening Napoleon. Though the emperor had busied himself developing the island's industries and even established a miniature army and navy, he must still have found time to brood upon his situation and could not have helped but think of himself as reduced to laughingstock. The Emperor of Elba was a poor title for a man who had once ruled over more than half of mainland Europe. Even some of Napoleon's old marshals now controlled more territory than the man who had raised them in the first place. To add insult to injury, the salary he had been promised in the Treaty of Fontainebleau, and that was meant to keep him in relative luxury, was often late and sometimes failed to arrive at all. Coupled with his deteriorating health and the express refusal of the Austrian court to let him speak or write to his wife and son, Napoleon must have felt himself well and truly slighted. Beaten, but not defeated, he resolved to show the coalition powers he could still make Europe tremble. Of all the incredible military feats Napoleon accomplished, none were more impressive than his escape from Elba and his return to France, which was literally a bloodless revolution. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, and in a desperate gamble, he landed on the French mainland with less than 1,000 men and marched on Paris. What happened next was truly remarkable. An infantry regiment was sent to intercept Napoleon and his men, but Napoleon rode up to them alone and shouted, "Here I am! Kill your emperor if you wish!" Upon seeing their once invincible emperor before them, the soldiers mutinied and went over to his side en masse. Other corps soon followed, and in short order, Napoleon found himself at the head of an army, marching on Paris. The newly reinstituted Bourbon monarch fled the city, and thus, with barely a shot fired, Napoleon found himself enthroned as emperor once more. Only a few months earlier, Europe had seemed on the point of securing a peaceful status quo, following the tumultuous years of Republican France. Napoleon, the bête noire of Europe's traditional monarchies, was safely exiled to Elba, off the Italian west coast, and the French monarchy had been restored in the form of Louis XVIII. Although negotiations at the Congress of Vienna were proving extremely fractious, the great powers were inching towards an agreement. All of that would be shattered by the escape of Napoleon in late February and his arrival in the south of France on March 1st. The impact of this one man on the volatile situation in France is hard to exaggerate. As word spread, his old regiments reassembled and rallied to the cause. The unpopular Bourbon king fled the capital, and the Allied powers in Vienna declared him an outlaw. In an astonishing feat of political chutzpah and military organization, within 3 months he seized power anew and rebuilt his veteran forces to a strength of 200,000 men. Of these, 128,000 were assembled into the Armée du Nord, under Napoleon's personal command. Its mission was the destruction of the British Allied and Prussian armies assembling near Brussels. For their part, the Allies were quick to recognize the threat and mobilize accordingly. Putting the squabbles of Vienna behind them, they established the Seventh Coalition, absolutely determined to beat Napoleon and restore the French monarchy once and for all. The British began to organize an army in Austrian Holland, now modern Belgium, under the command of their crack general, the Duke of Wellington. Wellington himself had rushed back from Vienna, where he had been negotiating on behalf of his government. His army also included powerful contingents from Holland and various German states, with the British component comprising only about a third of his force. Also in Belgium was a large Prussian army, under Field Marshal von Blucher. Between them they outnumbered the Armée du Nord, but they would have to cooperate, as these were the only armies within immediate striking distance of France. Politically, the British and Prussians had been at each other's throats in Vienna, but now they would have to work effectively against Napoleon, buying time for the rest of the coalition to move against him. Strategically, the outlook for Napoleon was bleak. In addition to the 2 armies confronting him in Belgium, he was threatened by a large Russian army already marching west, an Austrian army, and a Spanish-Portuguese force assembling on his southern frontier. The Prussians were also recruiting a defensive army. There were various smaller hostile forces around France's borders, and more elite British battalions were en route from America. Finally, a royalist revolt in the Vendée to the west necessitated the deployment of 10,000 troops there to restore order. Broadly speaking, Napoleon had 2 choices. He could fight a protracted defensive war, which would likely grind on, as in 1814, until converging hostile forces captured Paris, or he could attack. For a man of Napoleon's makeup, this was an easy call to make. Instead of trying to somehow survive a war of attrition like the kind that finally caught up with him at Leipzig, he decided to strike out towards Belgium in the hopes of defeating opposing armies in detail. Napoleon's move north has been subject to extensive criticism ever since. Certainly it was high risk, but it at least offered a chance of success. If he could defeat the British and the Prussians and capture Brussels, he could re-establish la gloire, French national morale and military reputation. He would then be in a strong negotiating position. Then, just maybe, he could persuade his other enemies to sue for peace, leaving him and his descendants to rule France. What became known as the Waterloo campaign spanned only 4 days, and during this critical period, Napoleon came very close to defeating the British and Prussians in detail. For just as he hoped to split the Seventh Coalition strategically and politically, by neutralizing the British and Prussian armies, he aimed to achieve this at the operational level by taking them on one by one. His Armée du Nord was bigger than either of his 2 opponents in the Belgian theater, so Napoleon aimed to smash the Prussians, taking them off the board, and then turn on Wellington's army. The British army lay to the north and west of Charleroi, stretched along an L-shaped front, covering the west and south of Brussels. The units were widely dispersed in order to cover all eventualities, but that also made concentration for battle difficult. The north-south leg of the line ran roughly 25 miles from Ghent to 88th, with the west-northeast leg from Mons to Genappe, the same distance again. Back from this line, Wellington had a reserve cavalry corps, and his main infantry reserve around Brussels itself. To their left, to the northeast of the French, lay Blucher's 116,000 men, organized into 4 army corps. They covered a curved line, running roughly from Charleroi to Liège, with Thielemann's 3rd Corps slightly to the south of this. The Prussian front was very much like the British, about 50 miles long, and less of a line than a series of divisional and corps deployments. Napoleon's choice, therefore, was to push in the center of the Allied position, at the junction of two widely dispersed armies. He quickly seized the town, pushing the Prussian First Corps northeast towards Ligny. To do this, Napoleon sought to interpose his army between those of Blucher and Wellington. On June 15th, he did exactly that, crossing the frontier and seizing the town of Charleroi. At the time, Wellington and most of his high command were at a ball in Brussels, and as the news circulated, British and Dutch officers coolly slipped away to rejoin their regiments. Wellington was one of the last to leave, and he was quoted as saying at the ball, "Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. He has gained 24 hours' march on me." Wellington snatched 2 hours' sleep before riding south to join the Dutch troops who were already engaged with Napoleon's legendary Marshal Ney at Quatre Bras. 7 miles to the east, Napoleon and the main French body were hammering the Prussian line at Ligny. Blucher and Wellington had been wrong-footed on day one, but their dispositions are understandable. They had a vast area of real estate to defend. Brussels was politically important, but a French lunge towards the northeast and Blucher's vulnerable supply lines was also possible. To the west, Wellington's hunch was that Napoleon would move against the British logistics, cutting him off by securing the Channel ports. They had therefore lost time, but now that the main French effort could be discerned, they needed to concentrate their superior strength so that they could meet them as a single force. Blucher, whose units had already been in contact with the French, had an earlier understanding of what was happening. Wellington, on the other hand, had less developed intelligence and did not receive definitive information on Napoleon's attack until late on the evening of the 15th, whilst he famously attended the ball in Brussels. Until then, he had been content simply to order his units to concentrate at the divisional level. The shape of the fighting on the 16th was therefore determined by Napoleon, still very much in the driver's seat. He moved northeast with his main force to engage the Prussians, following up the fighting retreat of their First Corps. At the same time, he sent Marshal Ney northwest, with about a third of his army, to seize the crossroads at Quatre Bras. This would hold the main road to Brussels open, and hopefully keep the British away from Blucher. It was a characteristically bold move, dividing the weaker French forces in front of their enemy, but it almost paid off. The Prussians made their stand at Ligny, some 9 miles northeast of Charleroi, and 7 to the east of Quatre Bras. Their position, carefully reconnoitered earlier, was based on a series of fortified villages. Napoleon waited until mid-morning, certain by then that Ney was engaged with the British at Quatre Bras, and that he therefore need not worry about his left flank. The battle was a fiercely fought seesaw affair, with villages changing hands repeatedly, and heavy casualties on both sides. Towards the end of the day, Napoleon broke through Blucher's center, forcing a retreat and, he hoped, damaging the Prussian army sufficiently to prevent its effective operations for the rest of the campaign. The 72-year-old Prussian commander had fought a skillful and brave defense, but it was to be his chief of staff, Lieutenant General von Gneisenau, who would make the critical decision for the Allied cause. Towards the end of the day's fighting, the brave Blucher was injured and incapacitated while leading a Prussian cavalry attack, so Gneisenau took command. As the Prussians retreated, he stipulated that they should move directly north, rather than east. Arguably the riskier strategy, this took them away from their supply lines towards Wavre, from where they could maintain contact with the British. Furthermore, the Prussians had Bülow's completely fresh Fourth Corps, unengaged at Ligny, on which to fall back. Bloodied though they were, the Prussians were very far from being knocked out of the campaign. Meanwhile, Wellington had fought Ney to a standstill at Quatre Bras. On hearing of Napoleon's movements at Duchess of Richmond's ball on the night of the 15th, he had ordered the British army to deploy between Nivelles and Quatre Bras. When Ney's forces arrived early on the 16th, they found a Dutch division already in possession of the junction. In an indecisive engagement which lasted for most of the day, Ney prevented Wellington from coming to Blucher's assistance, but failed also to land any serious blows on Wellington, a master of the tactical defense. Ney might have done better had he been able to use d'Erlon's First Corps, representing about half his nominal strength, But command confusion meant that these troops spent the day marching back and forth between the two battles, participating in neither. Indeed, their presence at Ligny could have secured an earlier breakthrough against Blucher. The result was that the British would also withdraw northwards, towards Brussels, and a small village called Waterloo. The 17th of June became a day of maneuver, rather than combat. Napoleon again reorganized his army, tasking Grouchy and the right wing, about 33,000 men, to follow up Blucher, while he led the rest of his troops, the left wing and the reserve, against Wellington. Napoleon's thinking was that the Prussians were essentially a spent force. Grouchy was told to push north against their rearguard, which Napoleon believed would complete the destruction of Blucher's force and vitally prevent it from supporting Wellington. Napoleon had hoped that the Prussians would retreat east on their supply lines, but that part of the plan would end up being unraveled. Meanwhile, the main French advance would be against Wellington. For his part, he pulled the British army some 7 miles north from Quatre Bras along the road to Brussels, to a ridgeline south of the village of Waterloo. This was a position which, like Ligny, had been reconnoitered beforehand. Napoleon followed up, encamped immediately to the south of Wellington, spanning the Brussels road, poised for an attack on the 18th. The evening of June 17th, therefore, found the two Allied armies only about 8 miles apart, in two different positions facing south, at Waterloo and at Wavre, to the east. Napoleon's troops had advanced against each of them in 2 parallel columns, but the main effort on the following day would be against the British. By 9 a.m. on the morning of June 18, 1815, the persistent rain which had plagued the armies for 24 hours had finally stopped, leaving the troops sodden and the ground absolutely saturated. These were no conditions for massed cavalry maneuvers, shifting artillery batteries, or effective long-range bombardment. The ground that Wellington had chosen to make his stand on was ideally suited to the type of battle he intended to fight. His army formed a line along a south-facing ridge, some 3 miles long. Behind the line, the main road ran north to Brussels, and within it there were 2 east-west roads which would enable the rapid reinforcement of threatened sectors. In front of the British right lay the large walled manor farm of Hougoumont, and in front of the center, the farm of La Haye-Sainte. These 2 outposts were garrisoned with infantry, tasked with delaying the French assault and enfilading any French attacks which passed to either side of them. Importantly, most of Wellington's infantry lay behind the ridgeline, on the reverse slope, therefore invisible to the French and largely immune to their artillery. Wellington was a careful general, although a study of his battles in India and the Peninsula will quickly dispel the idea that he was loath to attack. At Waterloo, he knew that on its own, the British army was outnumbered by the French, that British defensive tactics were highly effective against what was by now the typical French style of attack, and that Napoleon must indeed attack. Wellington's army was divided into 4 corps, 2 infantry, 1 cavalry, and 1 infantry reserve. To a degree, these were intermingled, with the cavalry mostly held behind the center of the main line, the reserves on the left, the 1st Corps in the center, and the 2nd Corps on the right. The forces that Napoleon had at his disposal on the 18th were organized into 3 infantry corps, 2 reserve cavalry corps, and the Imperial Guard, a corps-sized unit consisting of elite infantry and cavalry. These formations were less intermingled than the British. Reille's 2nd Corps deployed on the left, with Lobau's 6th Corps in the center, d'Erlon's 1st Corps on the right, and the Imperial Guard as a reserve at the rear center. The 2 cavalry corps were behind the infantry in the center. His position was also on a low ridge, extending from just beyond the British right flank at Hougoumont, through the inn at La Belle Alliance in the center, to the hamlets of Papelotte, La Haye, and Frischemont on the extreme French right. In places, the opposing lines were only 400 yards apart, making it an extremely cramped battlefield by the standards of the day. Some way to the French rear, a road from the east connected to the Brussels-Charleroi road through the village of Plancenoit. Napoleon's plan that morning was straightforward. He was confident that he could seize the outposts at Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, freeing up his main body to smash through the British center right and roll up its line. He did not anticipate any Prussian intervention, though as it turned out, the Prussians were already marching on his left. Waterloo. While sources differ on the precise timing of the first French attack, it was during the late morning and it came at Hougoumont. Anxious for the heavy ground to dry out prior to opening the battle, Napoleon had tarried over breakfast, confident of success. Now he planned to seize the farm as a prelude to his main effort. Notwithstanding the weather, he had managed to assemble his hallmark grand battery of artillery in the center of his line, 80 guns strong, and sometime after 11 a.m., the French artillery let rip at the entire British line, while troops from Reilla's corps moved towards the tiny garrison hunkered down at the farm. Wellington had posted a battalion of Nassau troops in and around the buildings, together with most of the light companies from the Guards Brigade in the surrounding gardens and orchard. Indeed, this opening phase was to be a light infantryman's fight, with sniping and counter-sniping amongst the trees as swarms of French light troops steadily advanced towards the main walls. In this, they were successful, and after an hour or so, the British withdrew to the central buildings complex. The British then brought their own artillery into action, battering the advancing formations, while the French used howitzer fire, which set the place ablaze. Try as they might, the French could neither isolate nor capture the farm. The high water mark came when a party of 20 or so actually broke through the farm gates and into the courtyard, only to be cut off from their comrades as a handful of British guards heaved the gates shut behind them. In retrospect, Wellington identified this as the most critical moment of the entire battle, and Corporal James Graham, who personally closed the gate, was later bequeathed a pension for life as the bravest man in the British Army at Waterloo. Even after his feat at the farm gate, Graham was to rescue his own brother from the flames in the burning building, having asked permission to fall out for a few minutes, in order to do so. As the rest of the apocalyptic struggle raged to the east of Hougoumont, this battle within a battle continued throughout the day. Napoleon poured in attack after attack, with Wellington's outnumbered defenders clinging on in the burning ruins. Efforts to envelop and thereby cut off the farm, which was kept supplied via a sunken lane running north to the main British line, were also in vain. As each threat developed, Wellington would match it with a fresh infantry battalion or artillery battery. Kellerman's entire cavalry corps and most of Reilla's infantry brigades were thrown in at one stage or another. From the French point of view, Hougoumont could be regarded as a costly distraction. It is perhaps worth recalling that this was one of the only firefights that Napoleon could actually see from his headquarters, and he personally insisted on the attacks and ordered the artillery bombardment. About 14,000 French troops were deployed in all, and they failed to capture the farm. To be fair, 3 points should be mentioned in his defense. First, the outnumbered British probably committed nearly that number to the struggle and its environs over the course of the day, including supporting units which fought to prevent the farm's isolation. Second, the near-constant fight for the farm effectively precluded its occupants from interdicting French attacks elsewhere for much of the time. And third, it was a threatening outpost which Napoleon could hardly ignore, as it was squarely on the left flank and rear of any French attack on the center of the British line. Hindsight is a fine thing, and had the French taken the Hougoumont, it is hard to believe that history would have judged their attacks so harshly. Certainly, the brilliant tactical defense of the complex, coupled with Wellington's cool release of a steady trickle of reinforcements, speak of good generalship and highly proficient infantry. After the battle, Wellington would say of this sector, "I had occupied that post with a detachment from General Byng's brigade of guards, which was in position in its rear, and it was some time under the command of Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald, and afterwards of Colonel Home, and I am happy to add that it was maintained throughout the day with the utmost gallantry by these brave troops, notwithstanding the repeated efforts of large bodies of the enemy to obtain possession of it." Napoleon's first assault on the main British battle line was delivered by d'Erlon's First Corps, smack in the center of the British position. The advance began at about 1 p.m., the French infantry pushing ahead in line formation, mindful of the vulnerability of their more familiar columns to British musketry. This part of the line was defended by a Dutch brigade on the forward slope, with skirmishers pushed out in front of it. To their rear, on the reverse side of the slope, lay a British division, and behind them 2 brigades of heavy cavalry. The span of the attack was delineated by La Haye-Sainte to the west and the settlement of Papelotte to the east. Although the entire British line had been subject to artillery fire for an hour and a half by now, this had not been as effective as Napoleon the artillery specialist might have hoped. The cannonballs were plowing into the soft ground, and the troops were lying down, minimizing exposure. Those behind the ridge were even more secure. Therefore, d'Erlon's divisions were marching towards relatively steady troops. To their left, they could see and hear the continuing drama at Hougoumont, and to their front, the Dutch skirmishers scampered back to their parent formations. The garrison at La Haye-Sainte was quickly isolated, as French infantry and heavy cavalry swept around both sides of the farm and up the ridge towards Brussels. Notwithstanding this, and fulfilling the role that Wellington had envisaged for them, the German troops within the farm peppered the flanks and rear of the French attack as it went forward. The Dutch fought bravely, but it was not long before one of their battalions collapsed and was routed in the face of heavy fire from Napoleon's veteran infantry. This left a gap in the line, and the French surged through it, but Sir Thomas Picton's men on the reverse side of the slope were ready for it. As the French lines crested the ridge, they stood up as a single man and delivered a devastating short-range musket volley, causing the French formations to visibly waver. It was a textbook example of shock action, the delivery of surprise and violence in one blow, but it was not enough by itself. For several minutes, the 2 lines fought toe-to-toe, exchanging ferocious musket volleys at less than 20 yards, the whole ridge line now boiling with white smoke, the roar of musketry, and the screams of the stricken. Picton himself fell dead. The British, outnumbered in this sector by more than 2 to 1, were faltering. It was evident that this firefight was now attritional, and that weight of numbers would shortly cause the entire position to collapse. The Earl of Uxbridge, commanding the 2 heavy cavalry brigades, saw what needed to be done, and both brigades were ordered to counterattack. The Household Brigade went in on the French left, sweeping away the remnants of d'Erlon's mixed force around La Haye-Sainte and charging down the slope until stopped by steady French infantry in square formation. In doing so, they sustained heavy casualties themselves, but knocked the impetus out of the French attack, badly cutting up 1 cavalry division and 1 infantry brigade. To the right of the French attack, the British Union Brigade rode into legend. As they passed the infantry lines, the Scottish troopers of the Greys were cheered on by their compatriots in the Gordon Highland Regiment. "Scotland forever!" they screamed. Some of them, grabbing the stirrups of the cavalry, swept forward into the melee. d'Erlon's tired infantry on the right were no match for the fury of a Celtic battle charge, and together with the Irishmen of the Inniskillings and the English troopers of the 1st Dragoons, the Union Brigade destroyed 2 infantry brigades and charged up the opposite slope right into the Grand Battery, slaughtering many of the French gunners. Unsupported, and with their horses tired, it would not be long before a well-coordinated French cavalry attack sent the remnants of Uxbridge's battered but proud heavy brigades back towards the British lines. He had saved the day in the center, but underlined yet again the weakness of British cavalry leadership during this period. Once charging, the regiments were almost impossible to control. Wellington himself would lament, "Our officers of cavalry have acquired a trick of galloping at everything. They never consider the situation, never think of maneuvering before an enemy, and never keep back or provide a reserve." By 2:30 in the afternoon, the first French attack on the British center had failed. Even worse, Prussian troops had already been sighted 3 miles from the French right. Hougoumont was still under attack, but both it and La Haye-Sainte remained in British hands. Napoleon had sent fresh orders to Grouchy, by this time engaged with the Prussian rearguard at Wavre, to hurry to the more important battlefield at Waterloo. By the time he received them, though, it would be far too late. Marshal Ney, in overall command of field operations and Napoleon's deputy at Waterloo, watched despondently as the remains of d'Erlon's corps retreated from the ridge. He could take some consolation from the repulse of the British cavalry, but he needed urgently to secure the central breakthrough that Napoleon had ordered. Hougoumont was still under attack. Perhaps if La Haye-Sainte could be seized, a repeated attack on the British center using fresh troops might just work. Ney, therefore, gathered several of the less exhausted regiments from the earlier attack and led a fresh assault on the farm in person. This too failed, unsupported by concentrated artillery fire, and with the German troops comforted by the recent sight of French troops sweeping back past their lonely outpost. There now occurred arguably the most dramatic, tragic, and ill-understood phase of the battle. At about 4 p.m., Ney assembled 3 cavalry divisions, about 5,000 men, for a charge against the center of the British infantry line. Wellington saw this happening, and had sufficient time to order the 13,000 troops in this sector to form square, the favored defense against cavalry attack. The squares were in a checkerboard formation for mutual support, with artillery batteries ahead of and between them. The result was one-sided. Cavalry simply could not charge home against a steady line of men with bayonets. The artillery opened gaping holes in the French regiments, the gunners running back to the safety of the squares as they drew close. Then the infantry opened fire, aiming low at the horses themselves. It was chaos and carnage, and horrendous casualties were inflicted. Within the squares, nerves of steel and strict British discipline kept the formations intact, a necessity because had one of them broken, it would all have been over very quickly. When cavalry broke into an infantry square, it typically destroyed the formation in minutes. Ney also failed to deploy sufficient artillery in direct support of his cavalry. 6 horse batteries were ordered forward, but this would never be sufficient given the size of the engagement, and they did not get close enough. Concentrated close-range artillery fire could do enormous damage to a densely packed square, but they had to be in range. Though his first assault had been so badly mauled, Ney chose to reinforce the failure. More cavalry divisions were added to the attack, with the result that at its zenith, more than 9,000 cavalry hurled themselves at the British positions. Still, the squares held. Charge after charge for 2 hours was smashed to pieces against the redcoats. British cavalry was used more cautiously than earlier in the day, hovering behind the line, darting forward, cutting up the battered French regiments and sending them on their way, before pulling back to await the next tide. At one point, a French officer, realizing the attacks would be futile, had tried to keep an elite carabinier brigade out of the action, only to have Ney add them to an attack once he saw them. One British veteran would describe the fighting. About 4 p.m., the enemy's artillery in front of us ceased firing all of a sudden, and we saw large masses of cavalry advance. Not a man present who survived could have forgotten in afterlife the awful grandeur of that charge. You discovered at a distance what appeared to be an overwhelming, long-moving line which, ever advancing, glittered like a stormy wave of the sea when it catches the sunlight. On they came until they got near enough, whilst the very earth seemed to vibrate beneath the thundering tramp of the mounted host. One might suppose that nothing could have resisted the shock of this terrible moving mass. They were the famous cuirassiers, almost all old soldiers, who had distinguished themselves on most of the battlefields of Europe. In an almost incredibly short period, they were within 20 yards of us, shouting "Vive l'Empereur!" The word of command, "Prepare to receive cavalry," had been given. Every man in the front ranks knelt, and a wall bristling with steel, held together by steady hands, presented itself to the infuriated cuirassiers. The stubborn Ney had squandered the lives of thousands of brave French soldiers, and all for nothing. Why did he do it? Views differ. It is possible that Ney's attack was simply a gamble at long odds. Ney was one of Napoleon's most accomplished officers, and he was personally very brave, so it may have been that he knew time was running out. Moreover, Ney could not see the squares from his position, and may not have known, though he surely might have guessed, that the British had switched tactics. Yet this view ignores the failure of the French to coordinate the attacks with their artillery, and the boneheaded decision to repeat the mistake time after time. The same criticism can be leveled at Ney if, as has been suggested, he mistakenly believed that a British retreat was underway, thereby creating a window of opportunity for his cavalry. The third view, proposed by some historians, is that the initial charge was a mistake, reminiscent of the charge of the Light Brigade 39 years later. This theory has it that the excitable cavalry regiments piled forward by an uncontrollable momentum of their own, after a single captain thought he saw a gap in the enemy line. Again, though, the questions about the subsequent attacks refused to go away. By 6:30 p.m., as the Prussian threat to the French right rear became extremely serious, but Ney's folly had already destroyed the cream of the French mounted arm. As the tragedy of Ney's cavalry charges played out, an equal drama was beginning to unfold on Napoleon's right. The tiny hamlet of Plancenoit, often overshadowed by Anglo-centric accounts of Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, was about to witness some of the fiercest fighting of the day. Within the space of 3 hours, it would witness a struggle between 50,000 soldiers and change hands 5 times. By 4:30 p.m., just as Ney began his fateful charge, the first 2 brigades of Bülow's 4th Corps had arrived at Frischemont. Napoleon, who had been aware of these unwelcome late arrivals for some time, had tasked the 10,000 troops of General Lobau's corps with blocking and delaying Bülow. No doubt he rather hoped that Grouchy might arrive from the same direction. Lobau, an experienced and gritty general, had garrisoned Frischemont, but it was not long before his troops were driven out of the farm southwest towards Plancenoit, a mile and a half further back, lying directly astride the lateral road to Napoleon's rear. From the village, open ground gave way to the north-south Charleroi road, a further half a mile to the west. A couple of artillery batteries placed here could easily interdict that road, and a retreating French army with it. The site simply had to be held. Lobau hurriedly made his dispositions but was unable to stop the momentum of the Prussian advance as more and more Prussian troops came boiling out of the woods to the east. They were supported by plenty of artillery and lethal regiments of lancers. By 5:30, Lobau had been hustled out of this second position, and Bülow stood poised to win the Battle of Waterloo for Prussia. The whole battlefield was now aflame. On the French left, Reila's corps was still hammering at Hougoumont, whose defenders clung stubbornly to the near-destroyed farm. In the center, Ney's cavalry continued their death rides against the British squares, and on the right, Napoleon ordered a division of the Young Guard to retake Plancenoit. 8 battalions went in, and within half an hour the village was back in French hands. Napoleon could breathe again. Bülow, still being reinforced, was not done yet. A second Prussian assault threw itself against the village, supported by artillery. Again the Prussians prevailed, and again the French were ejected. This time some of their best troops had failed. French reserves and options were fast running out. In a desperate move, Napoleon committed 2 battalions of the Old Guard, the best infantry in the French army, the Immortals. Proudly refusing to load their weapons, the Old Guard went in with cold steel alone. It was bloody hand-to-hand fighting, man against man, from building to building. In possibly one of the most astonishing infantry assaults of the Napoleonic period, the Old Guard recaptured Plancenoit for France. The road back to Charleroi seemed safe yet again. Garrisoned by troops from Lobau's battered corps, together with the Young and Middle Guard battalions, it certainly seemed that way. Yet the Old Guard battalions, flushed with success, overextended the position by advancing into the open ground to the northeast of the village. Here they were brutally assaulted by masses of Prussian troops and artillery. This setback, coupled with other Prussian units working their way south, round the flank of the village, made it vulnerable again. By 8 p.m., as events elsewhere on the battlefield turned irrevocably against France, the Prussians seized Plancenoit for the third and final time. Their guns unlimbered and opened fire on the Charleroi road. While the fight for Plancenoit swung back and forth, and while the defenders of Hougoumont clung on, towards the end of the afternoon, it seemed that Napoleon might still pull off an astonishing victory by breaking through in the center. At about 6 p.m., Ney assembled another assault force. but this time he would use combined arms. The main thrust would be over the familiar ground between La Haye-Sainte and Papelotte, with one regiment tasked with dislodging the King's German Legion from La Haye-Sainte itself. The attackers included about 6,000 infantry from a mixture of units, mostly d'Erlon's corps, but also some from Reilla's corps to its left. The remnants of several cavalry regiments were also scraped together, and horse artillery stood ready to advance for close-range fire support. From the British perspective in this sector, things hung on a knife's edge. Although most of Ney's cavalry had been decimated, and the slopes were now covered with dead horses and riders, the British infantry squares were exhausted. Casualties were mounting, and Wellington worried about their morale, especially among his allies. Prior to Ney's combined arms assault, Wellington had been able to shift 2 light cavalry brigades and some horse artillery from the extreme left of the British line to behind his threatened center. He had also moved some Brunswickers to plug a gap which had formed between his infantry formations. That he had the ability to do so can be credited entirely with the arrival of Blucher's First Corps under Ziethen on the British left flank. It had been touch and go, for Ziethen had wanted to move further south and join Bülow's attack at Plancenoit, which would have left a gap between the British and Prussian armies and not given Wellington the scope to redeploy those cavalry. It was good Prussian staff work which recognized the danger and induced Ziethen to change his mind. But for these last-minute adjustments, it is more than possible that the French would have broken through. As it was, it would be a pivotal moment, because just when Wellington might have been forgiven for thinking the worst over, he lost La Haye-Sainte. There were now some 900 King's German Legion and Nassau troops defending the farm and its outbuildings. In the sand quarry to its immediate left, light infantry from the 95th Rifles supplemented the defense and plagued the French lines with sniper fire. Like their colleagues at Hougoumont, these troops had been fighting for most of the day. Also like Hougoumont, the buildings had been set on fire by enemy howitzer fire. But the Germans were running out of ammunition, and the problem of running fresh supplies into the beleaguered farm was compounded by the fact that most used rifles. Their regimental supply wagon was stuck somewhere to the rear, and drawing supplies from the neighboring British battalions was not an option. When Ney's troops hit the farm again at 6 p.m., the soldiers were down to their last couple of rounds. The last struggle was brief and bloody. When the survivors staggered back from La Haye-Sainte, they left most of their colleagues behind, dead or injured. Major Bering's German battalion had suffered an astonishing 90% casualties. Ney was quick to capitalize on this, the first real French success of the day. The horse artillery rushed forward and opened deadly close-range fire on the tired British squares behind the farm. Simultaneously, the rest of his infantry attack engaged, and the last of his cavalry lay ready to pounce. This, at last, was the way to manage an attack. But it would not be quite enough. The British lines wavered, but Wellington rode behind his troops telling them to hold steady, and they did not break. At the crucial moment, British cavalry counterattacked, and Ney's infantry were stopped. This time, however, they were not sent bowling back down the slope. The French infantry stood their ground, and on much of the central sector of the battlefield, French troops now held the ridge. It was the closest Wellington was to come to defeat during the whole day. Napoleon was a gambler, who would reputedly ask whether aspiring commanders were lucky, something he believed in. Bold, risky attacks had been at the heart of his battle tactics for decades. Against usually inferior forces, and certainly against enemies who were in awe of the French fighting machine, this approach had secured one stunning victory after another. Now, at 7 p.m. that night, he was down to his last couple of gambling chips. Ney's well-executed combined arms attack on the British center had stalled, but only just. The Old Guard were making their brave assault at Plancenoit, hopefully to buttress the French right and rear. The attacks on Hougoumont continued, but without evident progress. More and more Prussians were arriving to support the British left and Bülow's units at Plancenoit. Napoleon did not have much time, and his only remaining uncommitted troops were the rest of the Guard. 2 battalions of Old Guard had been sent to Plancenoit, meaning 3 had been held back as a final reserve. That left 5 Old and Middle Guard battalions, some 5,000 crack veterans, for a last attack on the British center. As the attacking units assembled, the Emperor approached to wish them well. He had already passed the word that Grouchy had arrived with 30,000 reinforcements, a total but somewhat understandable lie. Now his mere presence as he rode down the line was enough to inspire spontaneous cheering. These men believed that they could do it, and so did he. However, Wellington's army, though exhausted and bloodied, was not the Austrian one Napoleon had decimated a decade earlier. British discipline and linear firepower would take on the tradition, elan, and courage of the best troops in France. The numbers were not encouraging, for even if a breakthrough were achieved, it is not certain that Napoleon would have sufficient troops to exploit it. Napoleon had to rely on the fact the British line was stretched to the breaking point, and if morale cracked and panic set in, who knew what might happen next? Wellington, meanwhile, had the good fortune to receive intelligence from a captured French officer about the likely location for the next assault, and he positioned his remaining cavalry accordingly. The Guard's assault was made in attack column, in 3 separate waves. Under constant artillery fire, they had tramped slowly forward from their assembly point at La Belle Alliance to their destiny on the ridge, between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, about half a mile distant. The first columns were met by a hail of close-range canister from the British gun line, which blew great chunks out of their formations. On they came, capturing several guns until troops from the 3rd Dutch Division fired into their ranks and turned them back. It was Dutch troops which first broke the Guard at Waterloo. The second wave met a similar fate. Cresting the ridge, they were surprised by the British 1st Foot Guards, who had been crouching in the corn. Blasted by musketry at point-blank range and in the flank by murderous artillery fire, the French held their ground for 10 long minutes. Wellington, close to the action as ever, ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge. The second wave of the Imperial Guard were scattered down the slope. The third and final wave was the last French attack of the day. These Middle Guard troops were engaged on 3 sides as they approached the British line, with Hanoverian soldiers leaving Hougoumont to fire on their rear, the main line to their front, and the British 52nd Foot swinging around to attack them on the left. Again the British charged with the bayonet, and again the Imperial Guard broke. With this, the other French units on the field began to panic as well, with shouts along their line of "La Garde recule, sauve qui peut." The Guard retreats, save yourself if you can. Wellington stood in his stirrups, waving his hat in the air and ordering a general advance against the retreating French. The moment of crisis had passed. With Napoleon's troops streaming down the hill, he knew that the French spirit had been broken. 2 British cavalry brigades spurred forward. These were the same troops that Wellington had been able to shift from his left once his flank had been secured by the Prussians only 2 hours earlier. The retreating Guard scattered before the British sabres, joined by d'Erlon's corps and Riley's men, until then engaged at Hougoumont. It was a widespread rout, as a huge mob, thousands strong, began running straight down the Charleroi road. Urged on by Wellington and their own officers, the British infantry battalions and horse artillery batteries gave chase. Both, personally brave, Napoleon and Ney attempted to stem the tide. The Emperor turned to those last 3 battalions of the Guard, still quietly waiting in reserve behind La Haye-Sainte. Under his orders they formed square in a doomed attempt to stop Vandeleur and Vivian's rampaging light cavalry. But the British brought up their guns and infantry, blasting the 3 squares at close range and forcing an immediate withdrawal to La Belle Alliance. Any hope of crystallizing some kind of defense there evaporated as the Guards barely paused, their squares dissolving into a stampede. Napoleon himself now left the battlefield with a small escort, dashing south towards Paris in the growing darkness. Ney meanwhile attempted a rally of his own, with 2 tired battalions of d'Erlon's corps, further to the east. "Come and see a Marshal of France die," he shouted, but stirring words were of no avail now. The troops broke and ran, and like his emperor, the bravest of the brave was forced to slip away into the night. The Charleroi road now became a killing field. Under constant Prussian artillery fire, fragments of Lobau's corps fought to hold it open behind La Belle Alliance as their comrades poured past. Prussian lancers probed around their flank, and as darkness gathered, they fell on the fleeing French, spiking them down by the hundred. It was not pleasant, nor necessary, for the French army was utterly shattered and would never fight again. It is not known precisely how long the killing lasted, but there had been quite enough, 9 or 10 hours of near constant slaughter. All told, the Allies lost about 22,000 dead or wounded, while Napoleon had suffered 33,000 casualties. By the time Wellington and Blucher greeted each other at the inn, the sounds of battle were giving way to the cries of the wounded and dying in the summer night. Local people scavenged the battlefield and began stealing money and slitting throats. 4 days after the battle, one man would report of the field, "This morning I went to visit the field of battle, which is a little beyond the village of Waterloo on the plateau of Mont Saint-Jean. But on arrival there, the sight was too horrible to behold. I felt sick in the stomach and was obliged to return. The multitude of carcasses, the heaps of wounded men with mangled limbs unable to move, and perishing from not having their wounds dressed or from hunger, as the Allies were, of course, obliged to take their surgeons and wagons with them, formed a spectacle I shall never forget. The wounded, both of the Allies and the French, remain in an equally deplorable state." Wellington had just ended the Napoleonic era, but he was personally distraught, and his physician noted the general's very open expressions of grief the night after the battle. The sentiments wouldn't change over time, as he often broke down in tears upon mention of Waterloo and frequently refused congratulations for the victory. After the battle, Wellington reported, "It has been a damn serious business. Blucher and I have lost 30,000 men. It has been a damn nice thing, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. By God, I don't think it would have been done if I had not been there." Wellington never wanted to see another battle, and he never would. In terms of casualties, Waterloo was not one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic era, but it was unquestionably the most decisive, and even today it remains one of the most famous battles in history. The Belgians themselves were well aware of its importance, as tourism to the battlefield started the very next day. By then, of course, Napoleon was in flight to Paris, but there, with the mood of popular opinion turning against him, he abandoned the city and attempted to catch a ship to the United States. He surrendered himself to a ship of the Royal Navy blockade when he realized his situation was hopeless on June 29th. This time, the Allies were less inclined to be as generous with Napoleon as they had been at Fontainebleau. Napoleon was stripped of all wealth and titles and banished to the remote British island of St. Helena in the Atlantic, thousands of miles away from Europe. Napoleon lived on that island in the Longwood House, a damp, dank place, but the British were still worried about a potential escape. At one point in 1818, false rumors that Napoleon had escaped panicked Londoners. Napoleon's British custodian, Hudson Lowe, treated him notoriously poorly, curtailing guests from visiting Napoleon unless they stayed indefinitely. For his part, Napoleon began dictating memoirs, but he continued to have machinations of escape, with contacts in South America and even old Imperial Guards members plotting a potential empire in Southwest America. Napoleon also hoped sympathetic British politicians might eventually release him. The poor conditions at Longwood began to take their toll, and Napoleon's health began to decline sharply in 1821. There was nothing British doctors could do, and on May 5th of that year, Napoleon finally succumbed to the poor health that had dogged him for much of his later years, dying in exile on the island of St. Helena. Given his treatment at the hands of his captors, and the fact he was only 51 when he died, controversy has often surrounded the emperor's death, and many scholars have gone out of their way to attempt to prove that Napoleon was poisoned, with autopsy studies and chemical analysis showing that he had abnormal levels of arsenic in his hair. However, it has also been suggested that most people at that time would have been exposed to arsenic and other toxic substances throughout their lives, so these findings are to be expected. Other findings suggest peptic ulcers, or perhaps even stomach cancer as the cause of Napoleon's death, though it is also possible that depression played a part in his demise. After the war, Wellington moved to Paris as Britain's diplomatic representative, and later, as commander-in-chief of the 150,000 Allied troops based there. Napoleon may have been exiled much further away the second time, but Paris was still a militarized city, and these were uncertain times. Wellington still was convinced that the key to a peaceful future lay in building a positive relationship with royalist France, believing it would be pointless to impose punitive measures. Naturally, Wellington was hugely popular in governing circles and close to the restored Bourbon French king. Honors were also showered upon him from Britain's allies. Wellington reveled in it, taking a large house in Cambrai and entertaining lavishly, but he would return to Britain regularly, where the Prince Regent sought his company and regarded him as a close friend. Wellington found the royal hospitality tiresome at times, but he understood that these were people he needed to influence. By 1818, Lord Liverpool, the Tory Prime Minister, was anxious to recruit the national hero to boost support for his flagging government. Wellington was interested in the affairs of state, already a highly trusted diplomat, and although still in the army, at 49 years of age, tired of campaigning in the field. Indeed, in 1816 he had reluctantly taken some American guests to the site of Waterloo, only to descend into an uncharacteristically maudlin mood, saying little at dinner that night. The carnage still haunted him. Offered a change of pace, Wellington accepted Liverpool's offer. Wellington was on his way to a long and distinguished political career. Napoleon was so successful during his age that Napoleonic warfare continued to be used during the late 19th century, even during the American Civil War. Civil War generals began the war employing tactics from the Napoleonic era, hoping like Napoleon to win decisive, crushing victories against large armies. However, the weapons available in 1861 were far more accurate than they had been 50 years earlier. In particular, new rifled barrels created common infantry weapons with deadly accuracy of up to 100 yards. At a time when generals were still leading massed infantry charges with fixed bayonets and attempting to march their men close enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat. It ultimately doomed hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side of that war. When a rail link between Britain and France finally opened in 1994, the trains ran from Gare du Nord in Paris directly to Waterloo Station in London. Neither nation seemed particularly concerned about this potentially embarrassing coincidence of name. Both were now mature democracies and had been allies in 2 world wars. The name lives on as an area of town just south of the river, and in popular British culture, people might quietly smile to themselves as they recall that after 700 years of on-again, off-again war with France, Britain had won in the end. In Germany, there is less smugness or indeed awareness of the battle, which was just as much a Prussian victory as it was British, and a token of things to come. The 20th century's sinister events subsequently bestowed a less romantic view of warfare within modern German culture. For France, it was a profound shock from which it was slow to recover, and to an extent the nation remains in denial about it. Like the fall of Berlin in 1945, or the collapse of Germany in 1918, Waterloo presaged a reshaping of the map of Europe. On such events, therefore, huge issues hung, for there can be little doubt that Waterloo could have gone either way. Whilst the strategic odds were heavily stacked against Napoleon during the Waterloo campaign, things would have looked very different on the morning of the 19th of June, if Ney's final attack had broken through the British line, or if Ziethen had chosen not to link up with the British left. As people continue to read about and debate Waterloo over 200 years after the battle was fought, it's always important to remember that it was a close-run thing, but Waterloo naturally lends itself to plenty of armchair generalship. General Baron Jomini, whose manuals were widely read by military men throughout the 19th century, analyzed Waterloo and concluded, "In my opinion, 4 principal causes led to this disaster. The first, and most influential, was the arrival, skillfully combined, of Blucher, and the false movement that favored this arrival. The second was the admirable firmness of the British infantry, joined to the sang-froid and aplomb of its chiefs. The third was the horrible weather that had softened the ground and rendered the offensive movements so toilsome, and retarded till 1 o'clock the attack that should have been made in the morning. The fourth was the inconceivable formation of the First Corps, in masses very much too deep for the first grand attack. Today, readers can praise the Prussian staff work, which has surely been underrated in connection with Waterloo, or simply point out that Napoleon should have fought a defensive battle. Readers can argue that he should have committed the Guards sooner, perhaps even given those 8 battalions to Ney for his combined arms attack that preceded the final attack. Historians can wonder at the ever-present Wellington, with his brilliant choice of position and cool handling of the battle under such intense pressure. Like other famous military failures such as the Light Brigade, some choose to celebrate the bravery of the French cuirassiers on their death ride, or the stubborn British infantry so underrated by Napoleon. The discussion about who did what and why on the 18th of June in 1815 remains as lively and entertaining as ever. But interest and excitement over the tactics and the results often overlooks the fact that 40,000 people were killed or wounded at Waterloo. Victor Hugo captured the essence of this paradox in Les Miserables, writing, "Everyone is aware that the variously inclined undulations of the plains, where the engagement between Napoleon and Wellington took place, are no longer what they were on 18th June 1815. By taking from this mournful field the wherewithal to make a monument to it, its real relief has been taken away, and history, disconcerted, no longer finds her bearings there. It has been disfigured for the sake of glorifying it." Wellington, when he beheld Waterloo once more 2 years later, exclaimed, "They have altered my field of battle, where the great pyramid of earth, surmounted by the lion, rises today. There was a hillock which descended in an easy slope towards the Nivelles road, but which was almost an escarpment on the side of the highway to Genappe. The elevation of this escarpment can still be measured by the height of the 2 knolls of the 2 great sepulchres which enclose the road from Genappe to Brussels. One, the English tomb, is on the left, the other, the German tomb, is on the right. There is no French tomb. The whole of that plain is a sepulchre for France." That was Napoleon's worst defeats, the history and legacy of the battles that stalled France's expansion and forced the emperor's abdication, written by Charles River editors, narrated by Bill Caulfield.